Fine, if you're going to treat me like that, you won't get to see your grandchild. The son, who had been constantly asking his parents for money, grinned smugly. Hate to disappoint you, but I'm better off than my sister. I have a steady job, and I don't need mom's help anymore. If you want to cut ties, go ahead. We won't let you see our kid when we have one. Stay out of our lives and don't expect us to help with your retirement costs because we won't give you a cent. With that, the two left. In the end, just as my daughter predicted, all they wanted was to take advantage of me and live a rich life. They even used my desire to see my grandchild to manipulate me. I won't let them control me anymore. My name is Mary, and I'm turning 54 this year. After having 2 kids, I divorced their father and managed to get by on the child support he provided. Luckily, I could return to my old job, which helped me cover expenses and save a little. I tried to make up for their father's absence, but I might have been too naive. The reality hit me when my son got married. Mom, could you help out again this month? Well, I guess I don't have much choice. My oldest son, David, married his high school sweetheart, Linda, about 6 months ago. They rented an apartment near my house, saying they were saving up to buy their own place. I even helped pay for a lot of their wedding expenses to support their goals. Still, David would ask me for money with a humble request. He'd tell me how his company was struggling, how his salary and bonuses were not increasing. He'd explain that Linda's parents were sick, and he had to send them money. He shared all kinds of problems with me. The more I listened, the more I felt he was being naive about his role as the family provider. Nevertheless, I kept giving him money for about 6 months after their marriage. Since we lived nearby, they often came over. We frequently shared dinners, and I thought David was bringing Linda over to spend time with me. Even though they were newlyweds, they seemed to prefer being with me rather than spending time alone together. I even hinted at this once, but Linda just said, "Your cooking is so good, Mary, I could eat it every day." Although I was flattered, Linda never showed any interest in learning my recipes or helping me cook. The years went by like this until my daughter, Trisha, started applying to colleges. At that critical time, I asked David and Linda to visit less often, but they still kept asking for money. Once the college applications were done, they went back to their frequent visits. Around that time, Trisha and Linda began to have disagreements. "Mary, your financial help has really saved us. The economy is so tough, and David's company isn't doing well. But that bag you're carrying, Linda, it's designer, isn't it? You seem to be doing pretty well for yourself." "Come on, Trisha, this isn't that expensive. Besides, you always butter up Mom for money. And Linda, don't you ever think of getting a part-time job or something?" "Trisha, that's rude." "Who's being rude here? Don't you feel ashamed relying on your parents for money?" "Well, I do feel sorry for Linda because I'm not earning enough." "No, not to Linda, to Mom." "It's all right, Trisha, let's stop this. We're all going through a tough time. Let's be understanding." It wasn't the first or second time Mary had to intervene between her children like this during meals. She understood Trisha's complaints but believed they needed to endure a bit longer. Mary trusted they would soon say they could stand on their own feet and wouldn't need more financial support. Above all, she didn't want to burden her children with money issues, especially without a father figure around. These thoughts ran through Mary's head as she finished dinner and began cleaning up. As Mary heard Linda speak up, she turned around with a smile, thinking the moment she anticipated had arrived. However, Linda's words caught her off guard. Excuse me." Mary paused, her smile freezing as she waited for Linda to continue. "Thank you so much for your support, Mom. It's really a big help." "It's okay. I'm sorry Trisha can be a bit difficult." "Don't worry about it, but I have a favor to ask." "What is it?" "Recently, I've been thinking about having a child, but I'm not confident about our finances." "What?" "Well, it's hard to have a baby when you're older, isn't it?" "Well, I suppose it can be challenging. So, I was wondering if you could increase the amount of support money a little more." Mary was shocked. David and Linda weren't satisfied with standing on their own feet. They were actually planning to have a child in their unstable financial situation. How could they think about having a child when things were so uncertain? Mary tried to gently suggest it was risky, but Linda seemed annoyed and pushed back. "Don't you want to see your grandchild?" "It's not that I don't want to. I'm an only child, and I really want my parents to meet their grandchild soon. But having a child will make things even tougher, don't you think? I'll get a job too. We'll figure it out. David assures me we can handle it." Despite Mary's concerns, Linda insisted they would manage fine and there was nothing to worry about. Reluctantly, Mary agreed to increase their monthly allowance from $1,000 to $1,200. When she shared this with Trisha, her daughter was upset, saying, "Mom, they're taking advantage of you." But Mary still hoped for the day when her children would be independent. A few years after I increased their allowance, David came to our house alone. He knew I was off from work that day and seemed anxious to talk. "Is Trisha here?" "I think she's studying in her room." "Why, do you need something?" "No, it's okay. I just have something to ask of you, Mom." "I hope it's not bad news." "Well, I was wondering if you could increase the allowance a little more." I had expected it from David's demeanor, but I was deeply disappointed that both he and Linda continued to ask for money without any remorse. I let out a heavy sigh and finally, in a stern voice, confronted David. "Enough is enough. How long do you plan on relying on your parents?" No, you're misunderstanding. Linda has been getting tests done at the hospital." "Is Linda sick?" "No, not like that. She's been getting tests done for childbirth, and it's turning out to be more expensive than we thought. We're short on cash. That's why I warned you about the risks of having a child without proper planning. What will you do if something unexpected happens? If the child needs medical care or if one of you falls ill, begging me for money isn't a solution." "Don't be so upset. I didn't expect the tests to cost this much." "Isn't that strange?" I turned around at the sudden interruption to see Trisha, who had apparently been in the living room. David looked irritated, trying to hush her, but Trisha cut him off and approached. "What kind of tests are you talking about for childbirth? Wouldn't a pregnancy test be enough to know if she's pregnant?" "I'm not sure. Linda went to the hospital alone. All I know is we're short on money." "Why did you let Linda go alone for something so serious? Usually, couples go together to see the doctor, right?" "David, you're off today, aren't you?" "Don't interfere. You're just a kid who doesn't understand pregnancy." "You're the one who doesn't understand, David." There was some arguing, but David couldn't counter Trisha's points and reluctantly left. While I thought Trisha had a valid argument, I asked her, shouldn't we give them some leeway, considering their situation? She sighed at me. "Mom, really? What do you mean? They're just after money. Their excuses are probably not true." "Why would you say that?" Unable to hold back, Trisha went to her room and returned with her smartphone. She showed me several pictures. It was Linda's expensive bag. Linda claimed it's a cheap one, but I think it's real. She mocked my bag, calling it pathetic, and laughed. "This bag costs $1,200, the same as the monthly allowance." "Yeah, and it's a high-end brand. No matter how cheap she says it is, she had a different expensive bag each time she visited. I think she's just using the allowance for these things." "You might be right. Linda had so many different bags. She was laughing at you behind your back, thinking you didn't notice." Then Trisha showed me a recording. It was a conversation between Linda and Trisha, recorded when I was at work and Linda had come over. "Trisha, I know you don't care about money and only carry cheap bags, right? Could you ask your mom to increase the money she sends me? You did something like this before and got money from Mom, didn't you? An extra $200 isn't enough. How about $1,200? She thinks she's supporting her son in his dreams with just $1,200. She should give us more, especially if she wants to see her grandchild." How bold. Don't you think it's better for young people to spend money rather than older people hoarding it? "Hey, Mom, are you still going to keep sending them money after they said all this?" Trisha's voice was clear and firm, revealing she had secretly recorded their conversation on her phone. Hearing it, I felt both disappointed and deeply sorry for Trisha. She had witnessed her brother and his wife begging their own mother for money. It was a wake-up call for me. I decided I needed to have a serious talk with David and Linda. I need to talk to David and Linda. I'm glad. If you're going to do that, I'll support you however I can. Thank you. The next day, I invited them over to my house. Linda arrived with one of her expensive bags, looking pleased. Trisha and I sat down with them in the living room. "I'm going to stop sending you money." "What? What are you talking about? We can't handle this kind of surprise." "That's right, Mom. My medical expenses are adding up and it's causing me a lot of trouble. Why don't you save your money instead of buying those expensive bags?" Initially trying to be humble and win my favor, Linda sighed heavily when I mentioned the bag. "Don't you want to see your grandchild?" I would worry about a child born to parents who are not financially responsible. So you're not going to help us even though your son is in trouble. I've supported you enough. I've been sending you money for 10 years now, David. It's time for this to stop. It was you. You must have said something to Mom. Trisha had nothing to do with this. It's my decision based on your actions. As I firmly stated my decision, David and Linda fell silent. I felt relieved that we could resolve things after a serious conversation. But then David scoffed and raised his voice. Well, fine. If you're going to insult me like this, then forget about ever seeing your grandchild. What are you talking about? Weren't you the one disrespecting Mom just now? You kept sending us money because you thought I was worthless, right? That's right. You kept giving us money because you thought David couldn't manage, right? What's your point? Sorry to say, unlike you, I'm actually capable. I've been earning my own money, so I don't need Mom's help anymore. You can stop giving us your pocket change. You're blaming us, yet you're admitting you can't survive without the money, right? Yeah, that's right, but don't expect us to support you in your old age after treating us like this. And even if we have a child, you won't see them. Stay out of our lives. With those words, they stormed out. Trisha's earlier warnings rang true. They were just draining me and wasting the money. Worse, they exploited my desire to see my grandchild. Trisha looked satisfied as I pondered the situation. Don't worry, Mom. They'll come crawling back soon enough. But from now on, it's a new game. Trisha spoke with certainty, and she was right. Just 6 months later, David showed up at the house in his work clothes, clutching his credit card statement. Listen to me, Mom. Linda's out there spending my money on bags and stuff like it's nothing. Oh, and why are you surprised now? That's harsh, Mom. Well, didn't she always behave like that even when she was receiving $1,200 from me each month? $1,200. She told me she was only getting $500. You didn't even know how much allowance I was giving to your wife, did you? That's disappointing. Mary recalled how she used to put the money in an envelope for them. She felt a headache coming on, realizing her son hadn't even bothered to check the amount before spending it. She's spending that $1,200 on all sorts of useless things, and our savings are dwindling fast. That's been the pattern. I don't understand why you didn't see it earlier, Mary said, her words also a self-critique of her past actions. Perhaps now, in a similar situation, David might understand her feelings. But he couldn't rein in Linda, and he continued to rely on Mary for money. There seemed to be no end to their arguments, with Linda's spending outpacing their income. It was unsurprising they couldn't save even with $1,200 a month handed to them. Observing their poor financial management, Mary couldn't help but question where she went wrong in raising them. Yet she continued to follow Trisha's advice, unsure of what else to do. Mom, I don't know you moved. Read the message I received about 10 days after the move. Trisha had anticipated that David and Linda would come asking for money again, so as a precaution, we sold our house and moved to an apartment near Trisha's workplace. We didn't share our new address with them. As predicted, they went to our old place and, finding us gone, sent frantic emails. David's emails were filled with apologies and lectures about how he wouldn't care for my old age or his children's future. If they're this desperate, I wonder if they treated Linda's parents the same way. I doubt it. Linda's parents are like her, always looking for handouts, Trisha informed me, sharing what she had learned about Linda's family. It became clear that from the $1,200 I used to give them, Linda had been passing on money to her parents. It explained how they managed such high expenses each month, and now, with their disposable income gone, it seemed David and Linda were feeling financial pressure from Linda's parents. I was speechless at how my son and daughter-in-law continued to rely on others. After seeing the emails, Trisha simply said, "I told you so," and blocked them. I felt no sympathy or pity for David and Linda, even if they apologized. They were proud of their education and qualifications, so they should work hard together. Absolutely, Trisha. Enough trouble with David. I've helped him out, even dipping into my savings while working, but I've done enough. From now on until you find a good partner, we'll support each other as mother and daughter.
On the day of the wedding, Steve left only a letter, a suicide note. When he did not return home, it read, "I made a big mistake at work and was fired. I am no longer worthy of making you happy. In fact, a man like me shouldn't even be alive. Therefore, I will disappear from Mandy's life. I will leave my parents' inheritance to my only family member, Jenny. She's still trying hard on her own, so I'm worried. I have signed the divorce papers enclosed. So please submit them while I am still alive. Why did he have to do this just because he was fired? Steve was indeed proud of his job. I must find him soon. However, 5 years later, I was invited to a friend's wedding and found a person at a wedding venue in New York. There, I saw a man in a tuxedo. Upon closer look, it was Steve. My mind went blank. But then, a woman approached me and revealed the truth, and my feelings towards Steve turned into hatred. I am Mandy Hansen, a 35-year-old high school teacher. After graduating from university and earning my teaching license, I became a teacher at the high school, where my father is the principal. My mother passed away while I was still in college, and for a while it was just my father and me. I married half a year ago. My husband, Steve, is 3 years younger than me, currently 32. We met when I was in my 3rd year of teaching. Steve's sister, Jenny, was in my first-year class. But Jenny dropped out just 3 months after enrolling. Her parents had died shortly after her enrollment, which led to her decision. I suggested she use a financial aid program, but she refused. Jenny didn't want to be pitted by her classmates, who mostly came from wealthy families. Both of her parents had worked for top companies, and she didn't want to be seen as different. Indeed, the students looked at Jenny coldly, treating her as if she were suddenly in a different situation from their own. It's understandable. That school became uncomfortable for her. Despite my attempts to persuade her, Jenny was adamant and eventually left the school. I remained concerned and visited her home, where I was greeted only by Steve. When I asked about Jenny's situation, he responded brusquely. Jenny quit high school right away and had trouble finding a job locally. So she moved to the city center where there are more job opportunities. Unable to contact her directly, I visited Steve multiple times to learn about Jenny's situation. Initially, Steve seemed annoyed, but over the years, he began to share more about his sister. About a year ago, when I visited to inquire about Jenny, Steve said this: "Thank you for caring about Jenny for so many years. At first, I honestly thought you were a meddlesome teacher. But I was drawn to how much you cared for my sister. Would you consider dating me with the intention of marriage?" It was a sudden proposal from him. I had never thought Steve felt that way. Initially, I hadn't been aware of my feelings, but eventually, I realized I had developed feelings for Steve. So, I happily accepted his feelings, and our relationship began. Half a year later, we got married. Steve, a local newspaper journalist, has irregular working hours. I also advise extracurricular activities, so we barely have days off. Although we registered our marriage, we couldn't easily arrange a wedding ceremony. However, being the daughter of a principal, my father insisted that we have a proper wedding. Hey Steve. I need to maintain my father's image at work, so I want to have a proper wedding. I'm often asked by my fellow teachers when the ceremony will be. Can you somehow arrange your schedule? When I asked him, Steve grimaced slightly and replied, "Well, I'll see if I can get some time off at work." Steve seemed unenthusiastic. Perhaps it's difficult for him to take a long break from work. Wedding preparations are busy, not just on the day itself, and it's stressful for both of us. I tried not to burden Steve too much, keeping the guest list small, and getting my father to help with the preparations as much as possible. We chose a hotel run by the Civil Servant Union where my parents had their wedding, because many of the staff knew my father and me, which would make the preparations go smoothly. Steve was only needed for the times when the groom's presence was absolutely necessary to avoid interfering with his work. However, Steve didn't even bother to choose his outfit, saying anything was fine. So I had to pick the groom's attire based on his measurements. As the wedding approached, Steve started coming home late every day. Perhaps there was some trouble at work. With a heavy heart, I awaited the wedding day. On the night before the wedding, Steve still hadn't returned home and hadn't even contacted me. I assumed he would show up at the venue on time. Just in case, I informed my father that Steve hadn't come back. And my father came to our house worried from early in the morning. What happened that Steve hasn't returned? Even if he's a journalist, the company should consider his own wedding. It was indeed strange. None of Steve's work colleagues were invited to the wedding. Any busy company should allow at least one superior to attend, but no. Not even work-related people were invited. Not even his only relative, Jenny, was invited. Steve said, "My sister is currently in an unstable job situation, so a wedding is out of the question for her." It felt like I was forcing a wedding just for my convenience. Doubts about whether Steve would really come started to cloud my mind. But there was no use in brooding. I decided to prepare and wait at the venue by myself. As I started to get ready in the bedroom, that's when I saw it. Sitting at the dresser to fix my hair, I noticed a white envelope on top. Written in brushed pen were the words "suicide note." In a panic, I opened the envelope. And inside were a piece of stationery and a divorce paper. The stationery was written in Steve's handwriting. "I made a big mistake at work and was fired. I am no longer worthy of making you happy. In fact, a man like me shouldn't even be alive. Therefore, I will disappear from Mandy's life. I will leave my parents' inheritance to my only family member, Jenny. She's still trying hard on her own, so I'm worried. I have signed the divorce papers enclosed. So please submit them while I am still alive." It seems Steve returned home once while I was out, left the suicide note, and then left. But why? Steve was indeed proud of his job. I must find him soon. Just then, my father entered the room to see how I was. "What's wrong, Mandy? You look so down." Startled by my father's voice, I turned around and dropped Steve's suicide note on the floor. My father quickly picked it up and read through it. After finishing, he looked at me seriously. "Anyway, let's cancel today's ceremony immediately. I'll contact the guests, so don't worry." As instructed by my father, I contacted the venue. For now, I told them the groom had suddenly fallen ill and requested the cancellation of the event. My father was also apologizing over the phone to each guest he had invited. I mentioned going to the police station to file a missing persons report, but my father stopped me. "Why wait? We need to find Steve. Don't you find something strange? Even though we're having the wedding for our convenience, Steve didn't invite any of his own guests. His sudden disappearance might have some reason." I had indeed found it odd. But usually, weddings are mainly planned around the bride. And perhaps Steve never intended to have a wedding in the first place, which is why he didn't invite people from his side. But what should I do? Just sitting here quietly, thinking something might happen to Steve. Leave it to me. With those words, my father quickly left our house. Told not to do anything. I couldn't just sit and wait. "Steve, please be safe." Ignoring my father's instructions, I went to the police station to file a missing persons report. Since then, I have been desperately searching for Steve. 3 years have passed, and there is no clue. Initially, the police continued the search because he had left a suicide note, indicating a life-threatening situation. However, if he had indeed taken his own life, he would have been found somewhere by now. No such information has come through. After 3 years, the police search is about to be discontinued. I still believe Steve must be alive somewhere, and continue to hope for his return. One day, I received a phone call from my father that left me speechless. Steve had been betraying me all along. For the past 3 years, my father had hired a detective to track Steve. The worst outcome had come to light. My father told me to submit the divorce papers Steve had left immediately. Despite this, I wanted to see it for myself before believing it, even if the detective's findings were true. Another 2 years passed, marking 5 years since the day we were supposed to have our wedding. A gaping hole remained in my heart. I was tired of waiting for Steve, barely holding on to any will to live. Over these 5 years, I devoted myself to my work as a teacher to avoid losing myself completely. Having been a high school teacher for 13 years, work was the only fulfilling aspect of my life. And I made a close friend among my colleagues. She had decided to quit her job and marry a man in New York. Though I had reservations about traveling to New York, I happily accepted her invitation to attend. The day arrived, and it was considered an auspicious day for weddings. Multiple ceremonies were happening at the venue. Among them, a particular bride and groom caught my attention. They were having a ceremony with no guests, just the two of them. Wait, there was one woman who seemed to be a guest. I could hear other attendees whispering about them. It appeared that the couple was in a common-law marriage. There were circumstances that prevented them from officially registering their marriage. Curiously, I looked at the groom and gasped in shock. The man in the tuxedo, upon closer inspection, was Steve. The circumstances must have been that he and I were still legally married. What my father had told me 2 years ago was indeed true. According to my father, Steve had eloped with another woman and had been living with her all this time. This was something I could hardly accept at the time because I loved him more than anyone. My mind went blank as a woman's voice called out from behind me. "Ms. Hanson." I turned around to see the woman who had been the only guest at Steve's ceremony. It was Jenny, though I hadn't recognized her at first because of her makeup. But looking closer, I could see her resemblance to the high school student she once was. "Jenny, is that you?" As I asked, Jenny covered her face with both hands, sat down, and began to sob. Ms. Hanson. I'm sorry." Seeing her suddenly crying and apologizing, I became concerned. "Jenny? Please, lift your head. Can you tell me what happened?" As I gently rubbed Jenny's hunched back, she slowly raised her head and said, "It's all my fault. When I quit high school, my brother misunderstood and plotted revenge against you. Because of that, I caused you such trouble and couldn't even come to apologize." Jenny continued to cry. However, I couldn't understand the meaning of her words. Being here might let Steve overhear us. If Steve had misunderstood something about me and sought revenge, it would be better to discuss it in a quiet place. Thinking this, I agreed to meet Jenny behind the venue after the weddings we were attending had ended. I returned to the venue of the wedding I was invited to. However, Jenny's words distracted me, and I was absent-minded during the ceremony. Fortunately, there were no speeches required of me. Still, a colleague sitting next to me commented that I seemed distracted. And the bride, my close friend, seemed worried about me at times. I felt terribly sorry for being in a daze at such a joyous occasion. After the wedding, I hurriedly left, telling my colleague that I had someone to meet, and went to the agreed spot. But waiting there was not just Jenny. She was surrounded by two others. Steve. I pointed at Steve with a trembling voice, my whole body shaking. There he was, Steve, and the woman he had married, in fact, still in her wedding dress, firmly grasping Jenny's arm. Seeing my face, Jenny started to cry profusely. "Ms. Hanson, I'm truly sorry. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to come here alone." "Shut up." Steve cut off Jenny's words with a fierce tone. What was going on? More importantly, why had Steve, who had betrayed me and lived with another woman, boldly appeared before me? Steve. Why did this happen? Explain it so I can understand. This woman is still talking about that? She didn't even know she was being deceived from the start. Steve's girlfriend laughed loudly in response to my question. Deceived from the beginning? I couldn't comprehend what she meant. Seeing the confusion on my face, Steve finally showed his true colors. "I wanted revenge on you. Because of a rich, privileged teacher like Mandy. Jenny felt she had no choice but to quit school. Yeah, I thought Jenny was acting strange, so after the ceremony, I secretly followed her, and wouldn't you know, she was meeting with a woman Steve was getting back at? You've got some nerve." Steve's girlfriend also glared at me as if I were her enemy. Revenge? What exactly did I do? That's not it, brother. Jenny tried to intervene, but Steve's girlfriend cut her off. Despite being silenced, Jenny struggled free and raised her voice. "Brother thought I dropped out because the teacher didn't protect me, but that's not it. I left school on my own. Yet you plotted revenge against her, planning to flee to Emma in New York after 6 months of marriage. Why didn't you listen to my side of the story?" What? So, that was it. I had been deceived into marriage by Steve. Realizing this, everything went dark before my eyes. I had loved Steve and waited for him. Searched for him all this time, and this was far too cruel. Just then, a rustling sound came from a nearby hiding spot. "I've heard enough, Steve." My father emerged, speaking out. "Father, why are you here?" As I asked, my father revealed that he was still having detectives investigate Steve's current situation. The woman with Steve, named Emma Anderson, had admired Steve since her junior high days when he was her senior. Additionally, when Jenny entered the same junior high 3 years later and joined the same club, she referred to Emma as senior. Emma initially ingratiated herself with Jenny, who was Jenny's admired senior sister. For instance, if Jenny was treated harshly by other seniors, Emma would defend her. However, in return for her kindness, Emma demanded that Jenny set her up with Steve. Originally, Jenny was unable to refuse a request from Emma Anderson, who was known as a scary senior. When Jenny asked her brother Steve to date Emma, Steve gladly agreed, seeing it as a big favor for his sister. Emma was delighted. And since then, the two have been dating ever since. In other words, Steve was secretly dating someone else while he married me, planning to betray me and leave after 6 months as a form of revenge. Especially disappearing on the day of our wedding would cause me the most damage. He even left a suicide note to throw me into panic. From the beginning, He had calculated everything and approached me with that plan. My father didn't just have a detective look into Steve's background from when he was in middle school. He had also skillfully gathered information from classmates who had graduated from the same middle school as Steve. My father, widely connected and trusted by everyone, knew that if he reached out, he would find collaborators. After finishing his story, Jenny apologized in front of me. "Ms., I really should have told you sooner about what my brother was plotting. I'm sorry. I was threatened by Emma. She said if I spoke up, she would take the inheritance from my brother and run away." "Hey! Don't you dare say any more." Emma hurriedly tried to stop Jenny. "The inheritance must refer to the parents' inheritance Steve mentioned in his suicide note. Wasn't that supposed to be left to Jenny?" Apparently, that too was a lie. And it seems Steve had been holding on to all of it for his life with Emma. Steve looked angrily at Emma. "Emma, were you planning to threaten Jenny and run off with the money?" "It was just an example. You would have been troubled too if someone blurted out what you were planning, right? I silenced Jenny for your sake. So you should be thanking me, really. Example or not, I will not forgive these two." Emma was complicit in Steve's schemes. "They have no idea how much they have hurt me." Moreover, Steve didn't even try to listen to his sister's true feelings and acted recklessly. And Emma kept the revenge plan a secret. How malicious can these two get? My anger reached its peak, and I yelled with all my might. "Enough from both of you." Sure, I may not have been able to help as a teacher. But Steve, while saying he was worried about his sister, never even tried to listen to Jenny's true intentions. Jenny had made a strong decision to live on her own without depending on anyone and left school. To think you took revenge on me for your sister based on a misunderstanding is utterly ridiculous. And you just enjoyed being part of it. Didn't you? What you two did was despicable. Don't you even realize it? Steve and Emma were completely taken aback by my sudden outburst. Seeing them like this, my father chuckled with a smile. He seemed to have something to say to them. "By the way, since you two had a common-law marriage, no one came to your wedding. But aren't your colleagues gathering for the after-party?" "What? Why would you ask that?" Steve asked with a puzzled look. I was also curious why my father would bring that up at this time, especially with a sly grin. "Steve, the company you're working for in New York, its CEO is a graduate from our school. And I happened to meet him on my way here." Steve was at a loss for words, understandably. His CEO, who knew the father of the wife he had abandoned after 6 months. If it came out that he had deceived his teacher's daughter, who knows what would happen? Steve seemed to want to ask my father something but was too frightened to speak. Then, my father took out his phone, which was already on a call, and began to talk. "Ah, did you hear that? Oh, I see. Well, I'll tell Steve then. Let's meet again. Mr. Owen." "Huh? Owen, as in?" Steve asked in shock. "Yeah, your company's CEO. He said he's canceling the after-party after hearing our conversation." "What? You mean this call has been going on the whole time?" It seemed so, and my father nodded lightly. He then began to explain how he had met Mr. Owen, the CEO of Steve's company, earlier today. By chance, my father was in New York for work and had run into Mr. Owen, his former student. he invited him for a drink since they hadn't seen each other in a while. However, Mr. Owen declined because he had an after-party for a subordinate's wedding that night. When asked about the subordinate, the details matched Steve exactly, still legally married to a previous wife. From the same hometown, aged 32. My father told Mr. Owen that the real wife was his daughter. And not only was Mr. Owen shocked, but so were Steve's colleagues around him. Then, when they heard that Steve was getting married at this venue, they headed here. My father had spotted Steve and immediately called Mr. Owen's phone, keeping the call going to let him hear everything being discussed here. I couldn't hide my astonishment that my father had gone to such lengths. Caught in my father's trap, Steve suddenly screamed. What should I do now? Our CEO is strict. And he always says he doesn't tolerate those who don't value family. I'm finished. Indeed, with his misdeeds known to such a boss, what would become of Steve? My father mentioned that the after-party venue was supposed to have not only Emma's company colleagues but also many others. And the reason for its cancellation would surely be explained in detail. As adults, their misconduct during such a significant life event as a wedding would undoubtedly lead to a loss of trust at work. Steve and Emma turned pale. Damn, what should I do? I moved to New York after quitting my job back home. And I just got a permanent position. I've been working at my company since graduating and moving to New York. I've even been boosting our performance, and now if I'm put in a disadvantageous position, what am I supposed to do? If only I hadn't cooperated with Steve. Both were only worried about themselves. But no matter how they struggled, they were merely reaping what they had sown. Steve, who always claimed to care about his sister, now ignored Jenny's wishes entirely, clinging desperately to Emma. It's troublesome. I initially relied on Emma's income when I moved to New York. What am I supposed to do for a living now if I might get fired? As he whined pitifully and crouched down, I felt relieved that my marriage had fallen through. This was not the Steve I had been searching for all along. Why had I ever loved such a man? As I realized this, the weight I had been carrying seemed to lift. More than that, I was concerned about Jenny, who had also been caught up in this mess. However, seeing the resolution of this chaos, she appeared calm. I gently spoke to her. Jenny, I'm sorry for involving you in such a mess. More importantly, how is your life now? She smiled and responded. Yes, after moving to New York, I worked while attending an evening high school. I graduated from high school and managed to graduate from university last year, while attending evening classes. So now, I'm a proper member of society. And my life has stabilized. Relieved, I felt glad for her, as I had been worried about her for a long time. Seeing my relief, Jenny looked concerned. Ms., what about you? My brother committed such terrible acts, risking your life. How can I apologize? What will you do now? With a slight smile, I replied. I'm not so fragile. Besides, I'm thinking about how much compensation to claim from Steve. I haven't even filed for divorce yet. As I said this, I glanced at Steve. At the mention of compensation, he flinched and looked away, then muttered in a barely audible voice. If you're talking about compensation, I don't have any money to pay. Steve murmured, almost to himself, but I heard him clearly. What about the inheritance from your parents? Steve looked startled by my comment. He probably wanted to keep the inheritance to himself, considering his future would be tough. However, since Steve and I are still legally married, His living with Emma can be considered infidelity. Steve had a girlfriend before we were married, and our relationship was nothing but a deception. If he claims he can't pay compensation for his infidelity, I could sue him for marriage fraud. Upon hearing this, Steve seemed to resign himself to the inevitable. Of course, if I were to file a claim for marriage fraud, Emma would be complicit too. So she would also have to agree to the compensation demand for infidelity. Luckily, having my father there meant I had a legitimate witness. I informed them that I would contact them later through a lawyer regarding the compensation, and my father and I left the scene. Steve and Emma just watched us leave with somber faces. Even if they thought about escaping, Jenny had promised to keep an eye on them. So it would be futile. It's reassuring to think that I have such a strong ally in her. Then, I decided to finally submit the divorce papers. It's been painful. But it seems like I'm finally waking up from a long nightmare. 3 days later, my father received a call from Mr. Owen, the CEO. Apparently, Steve's company handles ceremonial events, so they are strict about the formality of their employees' marriages. Naturally, Mr. Owen said they couldn't keep an employee who had deceived someone into a fake marriage, and Steve was immediately fired. As for Emma, she worked at a company in the same group, apparently hosting weddings. She wasn't fired, but she was removed from her role as a host and reassigned to menial tasks within the company. Her salary was also cut to less than half of what it was before. Still, I had no sympathy to offer. Steve had deceived me into a fake marriage and had been cohabiting with his affair partner for years. So I demanded $30,000 in damages from him. I also demanded $20,000 from Emma for infidelity. They ended up paying the total of $50,000 from Steve's parents' inheritance. However, life in the costly city center, where Steve had carelessly moved to be with Emma, left him nearly penniless after the payment. Thus, the two of them would probably live a meager life together. Emma wants to leave him, but Steve cries and clings to her, saying he'd be in trouble if she left him now, so she can't escape. Steve should have kept his high school admiration to himself. Jenny, who shared these personal details about Steve and Emma, has been in regular contact with me since then. She's doing well as an employee at an IT company. I still remember her as a student who was only with us for 3 months but was the top of her grade in the May midterm exams. It's truly gratifying to see her climb up by her own efforts. Moreover, Jenny told me via text message that she's getting married next spring to a man of her age who works at the same company. When she told me, I was so happy that I pressed the call button to congratulate her. Hello. Congratulations on your engagement. Thank you, Ms. Jenny responded with a bright voice. Her fulfillment in both personal and professional life was evident just from her voice. Additionally, she invited me as the only guest from the bride's side to her intimate wedding ceremony, recognizing me as her true mentor. Are you sure? What about teachers from evening school or university? Yes. For me, you are the only teacher who truly matters. I want to introduce you to him. So please come. Oh, and don't worry, I've cut ties with my brother. He's not invited to the wedding, nor does he know I'm getting married. Relieved and honored, I happily agreed to attend. Jenny is severing ties with her troublesome brother and building a happy home. Witnessing such a milestone in a student's life is the greatest joy for a teacher. As my father, approaching 63 and still revered by many former students, I aspire to continue as a dedicated teacher, following in his footsteps. Dealing with the fact that my father-in-law had died was hard enough. Then, in front of me, my husband, Scott, started saying something outrageous. And I was so shocked that I froze. Let's get a divorce. I've got my inheritance now. So I don't need an ATM like you anymore. For a moment, I didn't understand what Scott was saying. What do you mean? When I asked him to clarify, Scott grinned smugly and explained with great pride. My dad left me about $11 million. So, I don't need you anymore. Scott continued to express his dissatisfaction with me. You have no idea how cramped I felt. I mean, I was expecting someone better. Because it was a marriage arranged by my father. But I was disappointed that someone as plain as you showed up. Then why did you marry me? You could have just refused. It's obvious, isn't it? For the money. Who else would marry someone like you? I couldn't stay silent after being told all this. Fine. Here, the divorce papers. I agreed to the divorce from Scott without telling him something important. Let him regret it later. I am Gina Manning, 42 years old, running an apparel company. I married Scott, who is 2 years younger than me, 2 years ago. Our marriage began through a matchmaking arrangement by the president of Manning, with whom I had been doing business with for many years. And that president's son was Scott. Scott was an only child, so initially, Mr. Manning considered making Scott his successor. However, Scott himself had no interest in it and wasn't very capable at work. Thus, Scott quickly fell out of favor as a successor candidate and worked in the company as a regular employee. What attracted me to such a Scott was his easygoing nature. Ever since I was a child, I was often told by those around me that I was meticulous and serious. I loved studying, and while I was often praised, I was also avoided for being too stiff. I had been told by people I dated that I was not charming enough. It's not like dating a boss. It was shocking when I heard it, but I always thought I might indeed be too serious. So it couldn't be helped. Being laughed at for being inflexible was a common occurrence. I'm not good at doing things half-heartedly, and tend to immerse myself too much in whatever I do. For me, Scott was someone from a different world. I forgot today was a day off. During our first date, Scott surprised me immediately. There's a place I recommend, he said as he took me there, but it turned out to be closed on that day. If it were me, I would have panicked over the unexpected event. However, Scott was different. Then, let's just go to that family restaurant, he said, easily changing plans. For someone like me who lacks adaptability, it was an eye-opening response. I thought being with him might make me more flexible like him. So, I decided to marry Scott. Many people were surprised and opposed it. Some even whispered, "There's someone better out there." Even Mr. Manning, who would be my father-in-law, didn't seem very enthusiastic. I feel guilty for pushing my son onto you, but are you really okay with this? He asked. At that time, I thought, they just don't know his good points, but recently, I've started to think that perhaps everyone else was right. Right after marrying me, Scott quit his job. He stopped going to the company suddenly without consulting anyone. When Mr. Manning and I became worried and asked him why, Scott casually said, "What? Since Gina is earning, why do I need to work?" Both I and Mr. Manning were speechless and appalled. Why would he leave the income entirely up to me? Despite several attempts to persuade him with Mr. Manning, Scott's mind did not change. I wouldn't make as much as Gina even if I worked. The self-proclaimed dependent Scott made me want to divorce him immediately after marriage. It might have been cute if he were a younger man, maybe in his 20s. But the one throwing a tantrum in front of me was a nearly 40-year-old middle-aged man. In the end, we reluctantly agreed that he would at least take care of the housework. Scott's parents had divorced a few years ago. Incidentally, Scott's mother before the divorce was apparently not very good at household chores. That woman couldn't do anything, you know. I didn't learn anything from her. Scott seemed to be making excuses, saying it was his mother's fault he couldn't do household chores. True to his words. At first, Scott couldn't do any household chores. But after patiently teaching and praising him, he eventually became capable of handling most tasks. Although his skills were not high, he was satisfied. Thanks to me taking care of the house, Gina can work. Be grateful. Though there was something slightly irritating about Scott's confident profile. Saying anything more would ruin everything. Yes, I'm really saved thanks to Scott. While there were irritations, I think we were getting along reasonably well. About a year after we got married, a turning point came. Mr. Manning adopted a child. The boy, named Alex, was 9 years old. And seemed like an ordinary boy you could find anywhere. Mr. Manning is not the type to do meaningless actions. Why did he suddenly adopt Alex? I asked Mr. Manning when we were alone. He said, "It's a secret," and told me. Alex was the child of a subordinate Mr. Manning had cherished like his own. Mr. Manning had been close with Alex's family and cared for Alex as if he were his grandson. I wanted him to be happy. Recently, Alex's parents had died in an accident. Alex's parents had originally married in a way that was almost like eloping. And Alex had no reliable relatives. It would have been unavoidable for him to end up in an institution otherwise. I don't know if Alex is happy with me, but if he wishes, I want to be with him. That's why he decided to adopt him. Is that so? That's very like you, Father. Scott and I don't have children, so we have some freedom. Please rely on me if anything comes up. Mr. Manning smiled happily at my words. Later, to my honor, Mr. Manning relied on me occasionally as I had asked. Only when he absolutely couldn't return from work or had unavoidable commitments. I took care of Alex. Alex was initially nervous, but soon became attached. He's probably a sociable child. Or maybe he's trying to fit in his own way. Thinking about this gave me an indescribable feeling. Meanwhile, Scott was not pleased about this. He hadn't welcomed Alex much in the first place. His own father had adopted a stranger's child, which must have been complex for him. Even so, when I consulted with Scott, contrary to my expectations, Scott was concerned about only one point. What's he thinking, adopting a child? It'll reduce my share of the inheritance. I thought I could have it all to myself. I couldn't believe my ears. Scott did not have complex feelings towards Alex. He simply feared that his share of the inheritance would decrease. I'm going to talk to Dad. I'm not convinced. One day, saying that, Scott went to confront his father-in-law directly. When he returned home after a while, Scott was in an unusually good mood. Despite my worries, I hesitantly asked the grinning Scott, "How did it go?" "Ah, it's all good. My share isn't changing." "Really?" I thought adopted children had the same inheritance rights as biological children. So I was puzzled. While I was wondering, Scott smugly explained. Dad's making Alex renounce his inheritance rights. Of course. I'm his only son, after all. Could the father-in-law, who spoke so lovingly, really plan to leave nothing to Alex after his death? Something felt off. I wasn't convinced, but Scott was relieved by himself. Well, if your father says so, there must be some reason. Either way, my father-in-law is still in his 60s. It will probably be a while before inheritance is an issue. In fact, it's more likely that I'll have divorced Scott before my father-in-law passes away. I was naively thinking about such things. However, that moment came much sooner than I thought. A year later, my father-in-law was involved in an accident and passed away. I never thought I would have to say goodbye to him so soon. I had known him longer than I had known Scott. He was a person I respected both professionally and personally. After hearing of his death, I was overwhelmed by a sense of loss and couldn't stop crying. I was forcing myself to work through the heavy eyes and painful headache to prepare for the funeral. Scott was the chief mourner. But he was not grieving, just spacing out. Perhaps the shock made the reality of his father's sudden death feel unreal. I had to prepare for the funeral in Scott's stead. I managed to hold back the tears, though it was hard. It was tough for me during the funeral, but seeing Alex tearing up was even harder. Meanwhile, Scott still hadn't shed a tear. At this point, I began to feel something was odd. Scott wasn't just not grieving, he seemed restless, almost giddy. Sometime after the funeral, the reason became clear. Scott, isn't there something odd about you? Aren't you sad that your father passed away? I meant to express concern over him not crying, but his response was unexpected. Yeah, I'm sad, but the happiness is just overwhelming. Whoops, guess it showed. What? Do you get it, Gina? Dad was the president of the company. There's no way he didn't have money. How much do you think he left behind? What? How terrible. Scott had been spacing out, but from before the funeral until now. He had not been mourning his father at all, just grinning about the inheritance. How could you? What are you thinking? You'd think about it too, right? Since my parents divorced. And Mom doesn't have the inheritance rights, right? I'm the only real child. Alex has renounced his inheritance, so it's all mine, isn't it? How could I not be excited? Scott looked like he was about to burst into laughter. Seeing his face, I felt like I was about to hit him. His face was completely relaxed. He truly seemed to be rejoicing from the bottom of his heart. Unbelievable. Monster. Say whatever you want. I wanted to just walk away. But before that, there was something I had to tell Scott. It was about Alex. Now that the father-in-law was gone, I had asked Scott to keep Alex at our place temporarily. But now Alex would have to go to a facility if things remained this way. I wanted to raise Alex myself. It's about Alex. Oh, are you taking him in? That's fine. Scott agreed surprisingly easily. He continued with a smile. Because, whatever you do, it doesn't concern me anymore. What? Then, Scott held up a piece of paper towards me. It was a green paper, a divorce notice. Why, this? Confused, I asked, and Scott said firmly, let's get a divorce. I got the inheritance, so I don't need an ATM like you anymore. For a moment, I didn't understand what Scott was saying. Did he just call me an ATM and say I was no longer needed? What do you mean? As I asked again, Scott grinned smugly and explained proudly. Dad left about $11 million. So, I don't need you anymore. Scott continued. With this much money, I don't need to work, right? I don't need to please you anymore. No need to bother with tiresome housework. Oh, what happiness! With exaggerated gestures, Scott expressed his joy. I was deeply shocked by such a Scott. The inheritance was money that came because his father had died. Yet, he was celebrating as if he had won the lottery. As I felt earlier, there was no sense of mourning or sadness for his father in Scott now. He was truly happy from his heart. But money is a scary thing. It's not unusual for people who come into a lot of money to change completely. Maybe Scott is just a bit carried away right now because of the money. Calm down, Scott. Let's talk first. I put my hand on Scott's shoulder. Then, he shook it off quickly and shouted at me with a furious look. Shut up. You stiff woman. Stiff. I married you because it was arranged by Dad and you were a female president. I've always felt suffocated being with you. It's tough. Scott continued to voice his complaints about me. You have no idea how cramped I felt. I mean, I was expecting someone better because it was a marriage arranged by my father. But I was disappointed that someone as plain as you showed up. If that's the case, he could have just refused the matchmaking. I didn't force anything on him, nor did I aggressively pursue him. It's unfair to be portrayed as a victim. Then why did you marry me? You could have just refused. It's obvious, isn't it? For the money. Who else would marry someone like you? Scott laughed at me mockingly, admitting he had married me for my money. With a bold face, he began with, It's probably too late to matter now, but I'll tell you. And revealed a shocking fact. I actually had a significant amount of debt. What? My dad said if I married you and devoted myself to you, he would pay it off in exchange. So, of course I was going to marry you. So, Scott never loved me from the start. He married me just for the money. Well, it wasn't fun, but thanks to you, I was saved. Thanks for that. Watching Scott laugh crudely, I made up my mind. I didn't want anything to do with this guy anymore. I swallowed the last piece of advice I thought I'd give him. And just started filling out the divorce papers. I wrote without hesitation or doubt. Scott, who had been urging the divorce, seemed a bit surprised too. What, you've decided to get a divorce? Sure. Here, the divorce papers. After finishing, I even felt a sense of accomplishment. Now you and I are complete strangers. Yeah. Now, it doesn't matter what happens. Whether you live with that kid or I play around with young women, we're free. Scott was jubilant. From the looks of it, he hadn't cheated during our marriage. I had never suspected him, but I had to admit that was commendable. But if you're this happy, you should have gotten a divorce sooner. I couldn't help it. I wanted the money. Scott carelessly stuffed the divorce papers into his bag and hurriedly left our house. Continuing to live in the house I shared with Scott didn't feel right. I wanted a fresh start. This was the perfect opportunity to sell the current house and move. If possible, I wanted to live near my parents' home. It would surely be a support for both Alex and me. Alex would have to transfer schools, but he said, I don't mind. It felt a bit sad. But this allowed me to search for a new place without any reservations. Finding the right property was tough, but I finally made a decision. The proximity to my parents' home and the location were the deciding factors. It was expensive, but considering Alex, I thought it was the best choice. I took Alex with me to see the house, and he was thrilled, exclaiming, "It's a mansion." The house was spacious, and the interior was well designed. There was plenty of storage, which had been a concern. Surprisingly, it even had a pool. Honestly, I didn't need a pool. But seeing Alex's excitement made it worth it. Wow. Awesome. I would have been fine with any house, but I was glad he was happy. Then, we moved. It took a while for both Alex and me to get used to the new place. But gradually it became a haven of peace. During this time, Scott contacted me. He seemed desperate and wanted to meet immediately to apologize. I had a good idea why he suddenly wanted to say this. I could have ignored him. But since he insisted, I agreed to meet. I left Alex with my mother and headed to the diner I had chosen. Scott had arrived before me. He was sitting in a corner of the diner, looking pale and almost ready to cry. "Gina." As soon as he saw me, Scott stood up. I looked at him coldly. "What do you want?" "We're strangers now, aren't we?" "Don't say that. Actually, my dad had debts." "Damn, I never expected that from my dad." "So what? You got an inheritance of $11 million, right? Just pay it back with that." "No, the debt is more than that." It turned out the debt exceeded the $11 million inheritance. Because of this, Scott inherited both the assets and the debts, leaving him burdened with debt. I didn't sign up to inherit debt. Scott slumped his shoulders. "Please, Gina, you have some savings, right? We were married once, help me out." Scott pleaded with a sycophantic smile. Does this man not remember what he said? After all the times he ridiculed me and even called me an ATM. Who would want to help him now? It's surprising he even contacted me. Initially, he had said over the phone that he wanted to meet to apologize. Yet he hadn't said sorry even once. You really despised our marriage, didn't you? After all the regret you expressed. How can you dare say such things now? That was... Well, I never thought something like this would happen. It's frankly too honest. He thought he didn't need money from me anymore. But now that he does, he's groveling. Unfortunately, I can't meet your expectations. I don't have any money left. What? No way, that's impossible. I know your company is thriving. You liar. I wish he would stop blaming me, someone who's unrelated to his own troubles. I'm not lying. I just don't have any money to lend you. An ATM isn't just for anyone to use, right? Especially when there's no prospect of getting it back. Scott seemed to remember the harsh words he had once said to me. And his face turned a bit guilty. Yet, he still didn't apologize, a man with misplaced pride. What's with you? You've been so cold. Don't you care what happens to me? Oh, have you forgotten what you said when we divorced? Once we're divorced, we're strangers, and whatever happens, it doesn't concern each other. Weren't those your words? I can't understand how he can act like he's the victim. How thick-skinned can he be? Does he have the ability to forget everything that's inconvenient to him? I wish I had recorded his words back then to play them for him now. Maybe. I did say something like that. But that was just a figure of speech. Not what I really meant. I never imagined things would turn out like this. Scott leaned on the table, his head bowed. I thought at least the insurance would help, but the lawyer said I'm not the beneficiary. Oh, is that so? When I laughed in response, Scott looked at me with wide eyes. Don't tell me, Gina, the insurance, it's you? No, it's not me. Then why did you laugh? I just felt a bit sorry for you. If it had been life insurance, unlike inheritance, you wouldn't have to take on the debts. Indeed, that's why my father-in-law had Alex renounce his inheritance, and separately, he made sure to leave something for Alex through life insurance. Alex was the beneficiary of my father-in-law's life insurance. Is that all you wanted to talk about? If that's it, I'm leaving. There's nothing I can do to help you. Wait. What about, can we start over? I was just upset about my dad back then. But I really do care about you, Gina. You only ever saw me as a money source, right? I know that. Scott was denying it and saying all sorts of things, but I'm not fooled anymore. I certainly don't owe this guy a dime. Well, I need to go. Someone important is waiting at home. With that, I left the diner. I could hear Scott crying out in a way that seemed to beg for sympathy, but to me, it was just noise. I needed to get home quickly. Alex might be hungry. Or perhaps my mother had already given him something. I hurried to the station. As for Scott, he seems to be working multiple part-time jobs to pay off his debts. With no job history, qualifications, or motivation. He couldn't get a full-time position anywhere. By chance, I saw him working at a convenience store on my way to a meeting. He looked older and shockingly haggard. The dues for a life spent living off others' money had finally come around. There's no room for sympathy. Meanwhile, Alex and I are living peacefully. Lately, we've even been able to argue and fight. When Alex ignored me after a fight, I felt really down. But I take it as a sign that he's opening up to me. I plan to watch over him until the day he can stand on his own 2 feet. Surely, that's also what my father-in-law would have wished for. And now it's my life's purpose too. What are you talking about? I don't have any tickets for you. On the day of our long-awaited family trip abroad, I was unexpectedly confronted with these words. Left behind alone at the airport, I tried to suppress my rising anger and pulled out my smartphone. My name is Allison Baker, and I'm 26 years old. I work at a cafe attached to a hotel, where I met Ted, who would later become my husband, a few years ago. Ted comes from a fairly well-known business family. And it seems he took a liking to me for some reason when he stopped by the cafe for work. However, I couldn't straightforwardly accept his affection. The reason was that my mother was a single parent, and she passed away due to illness when I was in middle school, leaving me to be raised by my maternal grandparents. With such a background, I felt I was no match for Ted, an heir to a distinguished family. Although I was genuinely pleased to be favored by him, I didn't think I could accept his feelings. I told Ted about my upbringing, explaining that it was inappropriate for us to be together. But he insisted that family background didn't matter, and persistently pursued me without giving up. Finally, I gave in to how genuine he was and decided to give dating a shot. Ted's a little unsure at times, but he's really nice, and the more I learned about him, the more I felt attracted to him. A year into our relationship, we got married. Naturally, after our wedding, I moved into his family home. I didn't initially mind living with his family right after getting married. But unfortunately, I didn't get along well with my in-laws. Since they were never fond of their son marrying me, they often looked down on me because I was from a single-parent home. Ted works at his father's company and had openly declared me as his girlfriend within the company during our courtship, which might be why his image-conscious parents reluctantly agreed to our marriage. I told my in-laws that my parents divorced when I was 3, but without asking for the reason, they assumed infidelity on my father's part and ridiculed me. No matter how many times I tried to correct them, they wouldn't listen, suggesting that I must have been poor and poorly educated because I was from a single-parent family, and therefore I could only work as a waitress. Although my mom is no longer alive, I love and respect my parents very much. So I asked Ted to tell his parents not to speak ill of my parents in front of me. But he always vaguely nodded and ultimately did nothing. His father, a domineering company president who built his business from scratch, and his mother, who had held significant power at school parent associations for many years, were imposing figures in Ted's life whom he couldn't seem to defy. Ted, not naturally assertive, would retract his own opinions in front of his parents. Thus, for us to live peacefully in that house, it was impossible to go against my in-laws. Their hobby is traveling abroad. Ever since Ted was a child, it has been a tradition to relax and spread their wings during every major holiday. Today, as I faced my first major holiday as part of this family, my mother-in-law was joyously preparing a heap of brochures. After dinner, she spread them on the table and the family meeting about where to travel this year began. The destinations and hotel names listed in the brochures were all renowned, and I was culturally shocked by the glamorous life of a business family. Now, thinking of myself as a part of this family, I felt a slight confusion mixed with joy. As I curiously looked through the brochures, my mother-in-law suddenly asked if I had a passport. Having no experience traveling abroad, I shook my head, thinking I should get one early to avoid any trouble. Then she laughed loudly, mockingly calling me poor. My face must have turned red, but my father-in-law joined in the laughter. And Ted, unable to stand up to them, merely forced a smile. I began to feel discontent with Ted, who, as always, did not defend me against his parents' words. After numerous family discussions, the destination for this trip was decided to be the Bahamas. The reason was that they were familiar with the place from frequent visits, and a new 5-star hotel, recently a hot topic among celebrities, had just opened, and they wanted to stay there. I had no say in the decision, but I was thrilled. It was like a dream to stay in such a wonderful place on my first trip abroad. However, on the night the destination was decided, Ted, looking serious, approached me in the bedroom. Entering the bedroom, he hesitantly brought up the topic of the trip, suggesting that since the cafe might be busy during the holiday, it would be all right for me not to force myself to take time off. Given Ted's previous actions, I couldn't take this merely as consideration. The discussion about traveling during the holiday had been going on for days, and for him to bring this up now must mean his parents had told him to ask me to decline. Or perhaps he felt sorry for his wife, who would have to be mindful of his parents during the trip. I thought it might be one of these reasons, but I really wanted to stay at the luxury hotel we were booked at. So I assured Ted that taking time off would be fine. Despite his complex expression, he told me that he would be traveling on business with his father until the day before the trip and would head straight to the airport from the business trip location. Ted, being the executive director at his company, often accompanied his father, the president, on business trips. This time, the business trip would also include sightseeing. And my mother-in-law was joining them, meaning I would likely go to the airport alone. It was my first time using an airport, but in today's internet-savvy world, I figured I could manage most things by researching online. Even alone, getting into the airport and meeting up with Ted and the others shouldn't be a problem. In fact, I thought it would be more comfortable than going to the airport alone with my mother-in-law, so I nodded to Ted's words. Make a list of what you want for souvenirs. On the eagerly awaited day of the family trip, I meticulously prepared and left the house with plenty of time. As it was my first trip abroad, I had received various lectures from my mother-in-law beforehand. Some information differed from what I had researched, but I didn't want to cause a fuss. So I prepared everything as she instructed. This included a credit card because, thinking about safety, she told me that travelers should not carry cash abroad. So I brought just one personal credit card for payments. Excitedly transferring between trains and buses, I arrived at the international airport earlier than planned. As people around me strode confidently, I started to feel a bit nervous. After consulting the internet and looking at signs, I managed to reach Terminal 1, the designated meeting point, and spotted Ted and his parents near the boarding gate. Relieved, I hurried over, but my mother-in-law's indifferent attitude quickly dampened my spirits as she asked if I had already checked in. Admitting I hadn't, I started to look around frantically to head for the check-in, only to be stopped immediately by her. Planning to go without your ticket? You can't check in empty-handed, you know. Trying to shake off my embarrassment, I smiled awkwardly and turned away. Then, my mother-in-law extended her hand towards me ominously. Give me your credit card first. You're too careless, I'll keep it for you. Although I felt uneasy about her words, I didn't want to upset her, and obediently handed over my card, then asked her to give me the ticket. Her grin twisted into an ugly sneer. What are you talking about? There's no ticket for you. Stunned, I stared blankly at her as she laughed heartily, emphasizing this was a family trip, and there was no reason for an outsider like me to join. My astonishment deepened as I looked at my father-in-law, who was also smirking at me. It was then even my naive self understood the intentions of my in-laws. Hoping for some support, I turned to Ted, but he awkwardly averted his gaze. Realizing he must have known about their scheme from the start, my spirits plummeted. My mother-in-law mocked me for my naivety as I blushed with embarrassment and misery. But look, Allison has never stayed in a 5-star hotel, right? It would be sad if she made a fool of herself there since she's clueless about proper etiquette. Hearing Ted's unhelpful words, his mother agreed, claiming this was their kindness. Overwhelmed by my emotions, I clenched my fists, unable to retort as she spoke condescendingly. Why don't you try camping around here? Since you've come all this way, at least enjoy a bit of a travel experience. Leaving that said, my mother-in-law, in good spirits with my father-in-law and Ted making an apologetic gesture, disappeared towards the boarding gate. How much time had passed? After a while, standing there with my head down, I suddenly realized I was penniless. My habit of being overly careful made me stick to my mother-in-law's instructions perfectly. I just brought the money I needed for the train and bus. Now I wish I had set up mobile payments on my phone. Now, I couldn't even afford to return home, let alone go on a trip. Realizing that my mother-in-law had taken my credit card to further torment me filled me with rage. despite being married to Ted and living with his family. It was clear I was not considered part of the family by his parents. And for Ted, appeasing his parents was more important than his wife's feelings, making it clear that his loyalties lay with them, not with me. This realization made me completely disenchanted with the situation. "All right, as you wish, Mother. I guess I'll stay around here." Muttering to myself at the empty boarding gate, I resolved to retaliate against my in-laws and Ted. Once my decision was firm, I acted swiftly, pulling out my smartphone from my bag and calling my real father without hesitation. In fact, my dad is a businessman who owns the hotel group that operates the five-star hotel where my in-laws were supposed to stay. He had always dreamed of managing hotels since he was young, but had given up the pursuit when my mother became pregnant with me. However, his passion never faded, and eventually, he went abroad alone to learn international standards of hospitality. My mother was reluctant to raise a child in an unfamiliar country, so she decided to stay in America with me. The details of the discussions between my father and mother at that time are unclear, but they ended up divorcing, and my mother was granted custody of me, while my parents maintained family ties despite their divorce. They celebrated together when my father's dream came true, and he opened a highly successful luxury hotel abroad. After my mother's death, my father had invited me to join him overseas, but I couldn't leave my grandparents who had helped raise me. Nevertheless, I hoped to work with him someday, and continued various hotel-related jobs to understand true hospitality. Since my in-laws had never met my father, given that he was always overseas, and the wedding greetings were done over the phone, it's understandable they didn't connect me with the famous hotel owner seen on TV. As soon as my father answered, I skipped pleasantries and asked him to cancel their reservation, tearfully explaining why. While I knew it wasn't right to involve personal feelings in his business, I couldn't bear to let my in-laws win. My father was outraged and agreed immediately. However, another urgent problem was that I was out of money, which was the real reason I had called him. After the call, I learned that my father had just opened a hotel near the airport, aimed at American tourists. Stranded without money, I asked if I could stay there, knowing I couldn't immediately ask any friends for help, and still fuming over my mother-in-law's suggestion to sleep outside. I hoped to stay the night and sort out payment later. My father warmly agreed to let me stay free of charge, lamenting that this was the least he could do as a parent. Gratefully, I thanked him. About 8 hours after I had resolved to take action, my smartphone rang with a call from Ted. When I answered, what I heard was not words but a voice sobbing uncontrollably. Listening closely, I realized it was not Ted speaking, but my mother-in-law, complaining through tears. They had gone to the hotel they had booked as a trio, but the local staff had vehemently rebuked them for disrespecting the president's daughter of the hotel group. They were told that such people were not welcome to stay, and were turned away from the hotel. "Is the president of that five-star hotel your father?" When my mother-in-law confronted me, asking if it was true that my father owned the hotel, I confirmed it. She then accused me of hiding the truth. Annoyed by her implication that I was at fault, I responded coldly, "Why should I? To me, you are not family, just strangers." "What?" The phone was on speaker, and I could hear the shock in their voices. Imagining Ted's flustered face amused me. He would never guess that the woman he abandoned at the airport was now lying in a sweet bed. "I'm divorcing Ted." Please fill out the divorce papers when I get back. I'll have everything prepared by the time you return, I stated decisively. Ted frantically pleaded, asking if this was because he never stood up to his parents, and promising it would change. But it was too late. What now? It's too late by then. As I was about to hang up the phone, cutting off any chance for Ted to explain or apologize, my mother-in-law, who had previously been so domineering, suddenly sounded desperate to stop me. Wait, please. We've tried other hotels, but everything is fully booked. What are we supposed to do now? Why don't you sleep outside then? I snorted and spat it out, and as if I had just remembered, I told her that I was staying near the airport, as my mother-in-law had suggested. Well, I'm not actually outside but in a hotel suite. Realizing what I implied, my mother-in-law's voice turned frantic. You mean? After saying what I needed to, I didn't pay attention to her anymore and just ended the call. What happened to them afterwards didn't concern me. I had my phone number changed and left all the divorce proceedings to a lawyer, effectively making us strangers in every sense. Now, I'm dedicating myself to studying management and hospitality more than ever, aiming to repay my father's kindness and prove myself in his business. I'm expected to provide $50,000 support for the wedding? That's only natural as a parent, right? At these words spoken by my son, I couldn't believe my ears. I had just provided $50,000 for the wedding expenses of my son and his soon-to-be wife. Right after that, my son, changing his demeanor completely, spoke those words to me as if it was the most natural thing. His face wore an ugly smile I had never seen before, making him look like a stranger to me. As I stood shocked and speechless, he delivered the final blow. Mom, I have no use for you anymore. We're cutting ties. Despite having always taken care of various needs for my son and his wife, to think they would sever ties with me right after receiving a large sum of money is just heartless. Even today, I was helping them move into their new home at their request. I never imagined that the son I raised alone after losing my husband, when he was just 10, would one day cut ties with me. Then, his wife chimed in with a laugh. Exactly. We don't need you anymore, so we're cutting ties. Echoing my son, they both burst into laughter. Overwhelmed, I stood there unable to move. We won't even invite you to the wedding. Can you just leave already? Thanks for everything. After being told this by my son, I could only reply with a simple, all right. And without another word, I left their new home. My mind was all over the place with sadness, frustration, and rage. Why did I have to be treated so cruelly? Did my son see me as nothing more than a cash cow? Suddenly, I remembered the days when my husband was still alive, and we were a happy family of 3. My son was such a good, honest child back then. But he started to change after his father's death. I felt increasingly dejected, but I tried to stay calm. 3 minutes later, I called the wedding venue, introducing myself as the mother of the groom. I spoke to a staff member and conveyed something. I think the wedding will have to be cancelled. My name is Kathy. I'm a 55-year-old company employee. My husband and I met in college, and we married a few years after starting our jobs. Both of us loved children and wanted to have them as soon as we got married. But it took a while to conceive. After some tests, it turned out that I had fertility issues. I was deeply saddened, but my husband always took great care of me. Don't be so down, Kathy. Let's just take it easy. I'm happy just being with you. My husband never blamed me, always comforting me with a smile. Eventually, after 5 years of marriage and 3 years of fertility treatments, we were overjoyed to find out I was pregnant. I was so excited to meet our long-awaited child. And I spent the pregnancy in a calm state. Time passed, and we were blessed with a healthy baby boy. We named him Ryan. My husband and I cherished Ryan, raising him with great care. My husband was a wonderful father, always eager to take Ryan to the park and look after him. I wished for us to always live happily together. However, my dream was shattered when Ryan was 10. My husband died in a car accident. Despite the sudden and devastating loss, I couldn't keep crying forever. I had to raise Ryan on my own. I encouraged myself to be strong and raised Ryan single-handedly, bustling about every day. In the beginning, Ryan helped with the housework. "Mom, I'll fold the laundry. You take a break." "Thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate it." I was so happy he was growing up to be a kind child. But things changed once he started middle school. He stopped helping around the house and began to speak to me rudely. "Don't just serve vegetables. Put meat on the table. What are you talking about? That's not balanced. Shut up. Just do what I say." He often complained about meals, and I struggled with his behavior. He would also throw tantrums over things he didn't like. And I had many discussions with Ryan about his attitude. However, his arrogant behavior continued through his teenage rebellion years. By the time he was a university student, Ryan had calmed down, and his violent outbursts stopped. However, I was concerned about his reckless spending of his earnings from part-time jobs. Despite my frequent reminders, he would respond reluctantly. Yeah, I get it. Stop nagging." After graduating, Ryan got a job at a small company and decided to move out as he started working. I thought my child-rearing days were finally over, and I looked forward to a relaxed life on my own. Although it was a bit lonely at first, I soon enjoyed living by myself. 3 years later, Ryan brought a woman home. "Mom, I'm getting married to this girl." "Nice to meet you, I'm Jennifer." I was surprised by the sudden marriage announcement. But Ryan was 25 and a respectable working adult. I had no reason to oppose, and I decided to bless their union. Congratulations. Jennifer, my son might be a bit unreliable, but please take good care of him. Sure, leave him to me. Jennifer was 2 years older than Ryan, and they worked at the same place. Jennifer had lost her parents when she was young and was raised by her grandparents. I hoped they would build a happy family together. But Ryan then made a shocking request. "So, Mom, actually, we have a favor to ask. Jennifer and I don't have any savings. To save up for the wedding, we want to live with you at home." "That's okay, right?" "What?" I was taken by surprise and couldn't help but yell in a silly way. "Why are you so surprised? Isn't it normal to be happy when your son and his wife want to live with you?" Ryan asked, looking puzzled. "Wait a minute. Living together right after getting married isn't fair to Jennifer. I can help with the wedding costs, but it would be better for you two to set up your own place." I refused their request, but Jennifer loudly protested. "It's fine for me. I want to save money, so please let us live here." "Kathy, please." Seeing Jennifer pleading desperately, I felt conflicted. Honestly, I had no reason to want to live with them. My body was still healthy. I could do everything on my own. And I was finally enjoying my life alone after finishing child rearing. Also, having had many difficulties with Ryan before, I wasn't very positive about living together. Beside Jennifer, Ryan also pleaded, "Mom, please. Jennifer is saying this too. Let us live with you. We'll share the housework and of course pay living expenses. Please, we want to save money." Since they were both so desperate, I gave in to the pressure and finally agreed to live together. All right. If you both say so, let's live here together as three. Thus, our life together began. However, I soon regretted agreeing so quickly to the arrangement. "Kathy, I want fried chicken today. And for the soup, clam chowder soup would be great." "Oh, that sounds good. Mom, please take care of it." As if it were the most natural thing in the world, my son and his wife requested the dinner menu. They did no household chores themselves and never thanked me. They took it for granted that I would prepare meals, do the laundry, and clean. Despite also working full-time like them, all responsibilities were pushed onto me. Even when I came home later than them, they never did any housework. I naturally reprimanded them, but they wouldn't listen. Even cleaning their own room was left entirely up to me. Hey, Ryan and Jennifer. At least try to keep your room clean. It gets so messy that I can't even walk around just 2 days after I clean it up. You're too strict. You're better at cleaning, so please do it. Even when I expressed my concerns, Jennifer just grinned without any remorse. And Ryan sided with her, despite their initial promise to share household duties. I sighed heavily, disappointed. However, I could still bear it as they regularly deposited their share of living expenses into our joint account. But gradually even that became reluctant. "It seems you haven't put money into the joint account yet this month, have you?" When I asked, Ryan sighed loudly and grumbled, "Stop nagging. Just wait. Mom, when did you become so greedy about money?" "It's not about being greedy, it's about sticking to our agreement. Please pay your share of the living expenses properly. After all, you leave all the housework to me." While I was discussing this with Ryan, Jennifer muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "What a witch." Scary. As days like these continued, I grew increasingly fed up with my son and his wife. I tried several times to suggest ending our living arrangement, but each time, they both cried and apologized. Once, they even went so far as to kneel and beg me to continue living together, so I ended up agreeing. Years passed, and one day Ryan said, "We want to have our wedding soon, but we still haven't saved up any money. So, Mom, could you help out with the wedding expenses?" Ryan told me this with a grin, and I sighed. He hadn't been paying his living expenses properly. And now he was saying he had no savings. Wasn't the whole point of them moving in to save money? But I saw an opportunity and told Ryan, "All right. I'll provide you with $50,000 for a beautiful wedding. I'm looking forward to it." "Really? Woohoo! I didn't think you'd give us $50,000. I'm so happy." Ryan seemed ready to jump for joy, and I added a condition. "However, this is the end of our living together. You and Jennifer will need to move out." "What?" Ryan looked displeased, but quickly reconsidered and smiled broadly. "Okay. If we're getting $50,000, that's totally fine. We'll start looking for a place right away." Ryan agreed surprisingly easily. I had thought he might put up more of a fight. considering how comfortable he'd been living with me. Perhaps the $50,000 was just too enticing for him. Soon after, Ryan and Jennifer began looking for a new place. I referred them to a wedding venue where a friend of mine worked. And they both liked it and booked it immediately. Months passed. And with just 1 month until the wedding, the day of their move to the new place arrived. They asked me to help with the preparations. So I assisted them in unpacking at their new apartment. The place was modest, but spacious enough for two. They weren't thinking of having children yet. But I guessed they might move somewhere larger if they did. As I immersed myself in the work, the room became decent enough for normal living. Thanks, Mom. So, when are you going to wire the $50,000? We have to pay for the venue soon. Ryan asked with eyes full of expectation. Yes, I understand. I'll make the transfer to your account via online banking right now. I took out my smartphone and proceeded to transfer the $50,000 from my late husband's inheritance to Ryan's account. The transaction is complete. I'm looking forward to the wedding. Great. Okay, I'll contact Ms. Ford, the wedding planner, today to tell her we can transfer the ceremony fees. Saying this, Ryan was texting Ms. Ford. After sending the message, he put his phone on the table. Phew, that's a relief. That was all Ryan said, without a word of thanks to me. Neither he nor Jennifer expressed any gratitude, which irked me enough to comment. Wouldn't a thank you be appropriate? Ryan responded with the crudest grin I had ever seen. $50,000 is only natural for a parent, right? What? At Ryan's remark, I couldn't believe my ears. As I stood dumbfounded, he delivered the final blow. We don't need you anymore. We're cutting ties. Then, Jennifer grinned and chimed in. That's right. We don't need you anymore, so we're cutting ties. We won't even invite you to the wedding. Can you just leave already? Thanks for everything. Today marks the end of our relationship. Laughing loudly, my son and his wife said this. I simply replied, all right, and left their new place without another word. My mind was a mess of despair, disappointment, and anger. Why did I have to be treated so poorly? Did Ryan think of me as just a money source? Suddenly, I remembered the days when my husband was still alive. And we lived happily as a family of 3. Ryan had been such a good, honest child back then. But he had changed gradually after his father's death. My husband in heaven would be saddened to see what a terrible person Ryan had become. I felt increasingly downhearted, but I tried to stay calm. 3 minutes later, I called the wedding venue, introducing myself as Ryan's mother. I spoke to Ms. Ford and conveyed something. I think the wedding will have to be cancelled. Later, Ryan called me. Without even saying hello, he started shouting. What's going on? There's no $50,000 from you. And the wedding venue called to confirm the payment for the wedding expenses. Hey, what the hell is happening? Ryan was panicking, but I explained calmly. Of course, the money hasn't been transferred. I set up the transfer to your account to happen in 3 days. What? Ryan exclaimed incredulously. To begin with, I never trusted you and Jennifer with money. Because of your reckless spending. That's why I set the transfer for 3 days later, thinking I might need to cancel it in case something happened. Right after you disowned me, I canceled the transfer. What? I thought it would be transferred immediately. Ryan sounded shaken, even over the phone. Also, I informed the wedding venue. I thought Ms. Ford would be troubled by this. Without my $50,000, you wouldn't be able to pay for the wedding, would you? Don't joke around. Is that what a parent does? Enjoy seeing your son suffer? Just transfer the $50,000 now. Ryan yelled in desperation. It's funny he still calls himself my son after disowning me. Anger rose within me, and I told him coldly. What? We've disowned each other, haven't we? I'm not your mom anymore, and I don't have a son. Ryan's demeanor changed completely as he pleaded. Don't say that. Look, when I said we were disowning, it was just in the heat of the moment. I'm sorry, so please, cheer up. If you don't transfer the $50,000, we're really in trouble. We have no money. I have no intention of giving money to strangers. Goodbye. I firmly stated and then hung up the phone, immediately setting Ryan's number to reject incoming calls. Whether they proceed with the wedding or cancel it, I no longer cared as I had written them off. A few days before the scheduled wedding date, Jennifer called. Kathy, please, we need the $50,000. I'm not your mother-in-law anymore. I responded in a cold tone, but Jennifer pleaded over my words. Please, we've decided to go through with the wedding. We couldn't afford the cancellation fees, so we thought we might as well have it. We've borrowed money from friends, but it's not nearly enough. We thought about borrowing from credit card companies, but they won't lend to us because Ryan and I have both had delayed payments. Ryan and Jennifer had repeatedly delayed their credit card payments while splurging on branded goods. It seems that the reason they had no savings while living with me was because they were spending on luxury items. I'm not familiar with brands, but their room was indeed littered with expensive bags and clothes. So, we reluctantly asked our relatives for money. But now they all suddenly demand it back. When we mentioned that we had already settled the venue costs, they said they wouldn't show up to the wedding. It's only natural to return what you've borrowed. Even a child understands that, I said, astonished. But we have no way to pay it back. We don't know how much we can collect from the wedding gifts. That's why we need your $50,000. Please give us the $50,000. I refuse. There's still a considerable amount of unpaid living expenses from when you lived with me. First, return that money. If you pay back what you owe from that time, then I'll consider listening. Jennifer was momentarily at a loss for words, but then pleaded again. I'll return it someday. We really need the $50,000, or our future is doomed. You're the only one we can rely on now. You've brought this on yourselves. I don't know about it. And since we're strangers now, don't ever contact me again. I hung up the phone. Jennifer's tone was noticeably ingratiating, indicating her desperation. However, I felt no urge to help them, and set Jennifer's number to reject calls just like Ryan's. On the day of the wedding, Miss Ford, who was overseeing Ryan and Jennifer's wedding, later told me that hardly any family members attended. Their friends became suspicious when they sensed the odd atmosphere during the ceremony. The reception, which was supposed to feature a bride's thank you letter and family performances, ended up being only speeches from friends, turning it more into a lavish drinking party than a reception. Ryan and Jennifer desperately lied to multiple friends about why their relatives were absent. It seems like everyone suddenly had urgent work. Yeah. And some fell sick too. It's really troubling for everyone. They tried to cover up with such lies, but it was clear from their demeanor and tone that they were lying. Despite this, they kept talking, unaware their lies were apparent, and eventually started cursing their relatives. Really, if they were going to skip, we should have borrowed more money from them. We messed up. This comment led their friends to realize Ryan and Jennifer had borrowed money from their relatives, which was why most were absent. Disgusted, most guests decided to leave, but upon noticing this, Ryan suddenly stood up and went somewhere. He was heading to the place where the wedding gifts were kept. Fearing that his friends might demand their gifts back, he tried to hide them elsewhere. Enraged, the friends forced him to return the gifts and then left the wedding. Only Ryan and Jennifer were left at the venue, their faces showing despair as they began to blame each other. "It's all your fault." "Why did you say that?" "Because of you, everyone left. The gifts were taken back too. What are we going to do now?" "Shut up. Don't just complain at me. It was a mistake to marry you in the first place." Jennifer, infuriated by Ryan's harsh words, slapped him, escalating their argument. Ms. Ford tried to calm them down, but they continued fighting, and the wedding ended in the worst possible way. I apologized to Ms. Ford for the inconvenience and sighed deeply at Ryan. A few days later, on a holiday, I was sitting on the sofa watching a movie, enjoying a relaxing day. Then I heard someone fiddling with the entrance lock, followed by the doorbell ringing insistently. I immediately knew who it was and frowned. I thought about ignoring it, but not wanting to cause a disturbance in the neighborhood, I reluctantly stood up and first checked the monitor. As expected, the people I anticipated were on the screen. As I thought, I muttered, then slowly opened the door. The person who had been fiddling with the lock shouted as soon as they saw my face, "Why are you so slow to answer? And why did you change the locks, Mom?" Yes, it was Ryan. I had changed the locks right after they declared our disownment. Our wedding turned out horribly because of you. Next to Ryan, Jennifer also glared at me with eyes full of hatred. "What are you doing coming here all of a sudden? I have nothing to talk to you about anymore. Please go back home." As I said this wearily, Ryan blurted out something outrageous. "It's because you didn't transfer the $50,000 to me that our wedding was ruined. So you need to pay us $100,000 as compensation." "What?" I inadvertently let out a dumbfounded exclamation. How could they blame me so brazenly after how they've treated me? Moreover, $100,000 is just unrealistic. It pains me to see how my own son has turned out like this. That's right. You're the worst, Kathy. And because of you, all the relatives skipped the wedding. It's all your fault that we suffered. Jennifer ranted, and I looked at them both with a cold gaze, realizing they only ever blame others. I decided to confront them with the truth. I received a call from the relatives saying how appalling it is that a mother would steal the $50,000 wedding fund saved up by her son. I was shocked by such an outrageous accusation. "You two lied to the relatives to borrow money, didn't you?" They both visibly flinched at my words. "I revealed your lies by showing the relatives the bank records for the $50,000 transfer and its cancellation that I had prepared in case you turned on me." "Why would you do such a thing?" Ryan protested, his voice trembling. I was being made out to be the villain. It's only natural that I'd defend myself. Their lies about me had spread, and when the relatives found out, they were furious. So that's why they suddenly demanded their money back. But we already told everyone we had paid the venue with the borrowed money. And everyone got really angry. They even started saying they wouldn't attend the wedding. Jennifer explained in a meek voice, visibly pale. This is clearly all your fault, Mom. Pay us the $100,000. Ryan glared at me, yelling. I responded coldly to his unreasonable demands. What you're saying is nonsensical. Asking for $50,000 and now $100,000. All you ever do is demand money in such a vulgar manner. Also, I've put this house on the market. It's already sold, and I'll be moving out soon. So don't come here anymore. Even if you do, I won't be here. What? Why did you sell it without telling me? This is also my home. Ryan shouted, kicking a potted plant beside the door. His anger seemingly unappeasable, his eyes flashing with rage. I was momentarily intimidated by his fury but quickly reminded myself that I was not in the wrong and regained my composure. With firm resolve, I told him, the house is in my name. What I do with it is my business. At my words, Ryan fumbled for a response, then seemed to have an epiphany, and said, Hey! What about the money from the sale? It must have sold for a lot given the location. As your son, I deserve some of that money. What? We've already severed ties, so you are no longer my son. Don't make me repeat myself. And after all, you were the one who disowned me. Yet now you act all entitled. As I expressed my disgust, Ryan exploded in anger. Don't mess with me, old hag. Just give us the money. That's right. Give us the money. Faced with their escalating demands, I sighed deeply and said, Please leave now. Goodbye, and closed the door on them. They continued shouting outside the door. Believing this was becoming a neighborhood nuisance. I was about to call the police when I heard from outside. This is the police. We've received a noise complaint. Can we speak with you? It turned out the neighbors had already called the police. Ryan and Jennifer immediately quieted down and began profusely apologizing. Police? Oh, no, I'm sorry. We were just being loud. I could hear Ryan's voice apologizing in a flustered tone. What's going on here? Nothing. We were just visiting someone here. We'll be leaving now. Sorry for causing a disturbance. Jennifer desperately tried to smooth things over with the police. After receiving a warning, they left quickly. Soon after, the police rang my bell. And I explained the situation. They advised me to report any further issues. And I thanked them, hoping there would be no next time. Later, I moved and started fresh elsewhere, keeping my new address unknown to Ryan and Jennifer. Considering my future, I decided to retire early, having just had my last day at work. I was grateful to have worked there, especially since I started that job when I knew I had to raise Ryan alone after my husband passed away. I used my retirement funds and the inheritance my husband left me to move into an apartment with prioritized helper services. Considering my future living alone, I thought carefully about my old age and decided on this apartment. The layout is one room which is perfect for living alone. The area is filled with parks and green spaces, which I really like. There are also amenities like supermarkets, cafes, and bakeries nearby, making it a very livable environment. I still hear about Ryan and Jennifer from relatives occasionally. After the wedding, even their friends abandoned them. And they couldn't repay the borrowed money. Some relatives, losing patience, went to their home only to find it abandoned. The couple had fled to escape their debts. However, using a private detective, the relatives located them and, through a court order, started deducting repayments directly from their wages to escape from the debts they owed to relatives. Ryan and Jennifer quit their previous jobs and found new employment at small companies, with salaries lower than before and further deductions for debt repayments. They are reportedly living a difficult life. Their relationship seems to be deteriorating as well, with constant bickering and blame shifting between them. Given these circumstances, it's unlikely they can afford luxuries like brand name goods anymore. Ryan and Jennifer are still looking for me, surprisingly still hoping to receive money from me despite my clear stance of never intending to give them any. They are even persistently asking relatives about my whereabouts. But thankfully, everyone is sympathetic towards me, and nobody has revealed my location. I've only shared my new address with a select few relatives, so it's unlikely that they will discover where I live. I've retired and I'm really enjoying a calm life in a new area, and I have no plans to ever reach out to Ryan and Jennifer again. I have completely written them off. As long as I live modestly, my current finances are sufficient. But I'm considering working at a nearby supermarket to save a bit more money. Despite everything that has happened, I'm now living a very happy life. You're not working, so you must have free time. My husband grumbled as he suggested I take care of my grandchild, just to appease our son and daughter-in-law, who were irritable from parenting fatigue. Despite gifting the young couple a spa trip, Tony had no intentions of looking after the grandkids himself. If the couple was in a bad mood, the children would be too, forcing me to reluctantly agree. However, this set a precedent, and soon, childcare and household chores were completely dumped onto me. Even after giving birth to their second child, I was left to care for the infant. Both my husband and son's family treated me as though I was nothing more than a babysitter and maid, despite me being a homemaker. I convinced myself that these were my duties and continued to endure this life. One day, after shopping alone for the first time in a long while, I overheard my son and his wife at home mocking. "Do we even need that maid?" The maid treating me merely as domestic help, with Tony doing nothing to correct them. An incompetent maid is seriously in the way. Should we just live by ourselves? My son suggested, and my husband agreed. Sounds good. In an instant, my affection for my family cooled, and I silently left the house, resolving in my heart, I'll live my life the way I want. I am Perry Stone. After graduating from vocational school, I entered the hospitality industry. I met Tony, who was a sales representative for a supplier to the hotel I worked at, and got married at 23. My father had expressed concern, saying, "Isn't it better to wait a bit longer to get married? Maybe after you're more accustomed to your job." At the time, being in love, I thought it didn't matter whether it was sooner or later. Now, I understand my parents' concerns. Tony had only been working for 2 years after graduating from college. His income wasn't bad but wasn't exceptionally good either. It was manageable while both of us worked. But having children would change the equation, something I now comprehend. At 25, I gave birth to my son, Ryan. Relying solely on Tony's income brought financial instability. So I wanted to continue working. However, most of my days off in the hotel industry were on weekdays. Even after enrolling Ryan in daycare, weekends still required someone else's help since Tony often had to work then too. After discussions, I decided to become a full-time homemaker, largely because Tony insisted. For Ryan's sake, I'll work harder. I want you to be by Ryan's side. Tony was aware that his income at the time was insufficient to support his family. So after Ryan was born, he worked even harder than before. This led to me being mostly on my own in terms of childcare, which often resulted in arguments between us. It was then that I first understood why our parents had suggested we delay our marriage. Although I regretted not listening to the advice of those more experienced in life, I have never regretted having Ryan. Thanks to Tony's hard work and recognition at a young age, which led to an early promotion, Ryan was able to graduate from university without needing to take out any student loans. Our family had endured those challenging times, and one day, after more than 30 years together, Ryan brought home his fiancée, Vanessa, who was 3 years his junior at 27. Ryan, now 30, had been working for about 8 years, likely earning a decent salary. With some savings, good timing for marriage. Vanessa, with her charming demeanor, instantly won us over. On the day she came to introduce herself, she complimented my cooking while standing in the kitchen, saying, "Mother, you're such a good cook. I hope you can teach me someday." Tony also spoke highly of her. "It's commendable that you'll continue to work even after getting married. Quite different from my wife who's just a homemaker." Though I disliked being compared, arguing would only worsen the atmosphere. I tried not to let Tony's words bother me. However, Tony continued to belittle me. Ryan's mother, Perry, has been a housewife ever since he was born. She can't do anything but housework. You should learn from Vanessa. When Ryan started elementary school, I expressed a desire to work part-time. But Tony dismissed it. "You working? Impossible. Just quietly do the household chores, that's all you're capable of." Holding back my irritation with a forced smile, Vanessa commented, "Being able to do housework is enviable. I'm really bad at it." Her words calmed me slightly. She was a thoughtful and considerate girl, and I felt reassured about building a good mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship. However, as the conversation progressed, it became apparent that her earlier statement about struggling with housework wasn't meant to comfort me. She mostly ate out, hired a cleaning service twice a month, and did laundry only once a week. This routine might be acceptable for someone living alone, but I wondered if she could handle the responsibilities of a housewife after marriage. Ryan had never done household chores either. I regretted not teaching him earlier. If they were to both work, they should share the household duties. If Ryan knew how to do chores, he could have taught her. While I pondered this, Tony suggested, "Why don't you all live with us?" I was taken aback by his proposal. While I feel a sense of loneliness knowing that Ryan still lives at home and will eventually leave, I understand that no young bride would want to live with her in-laws. Yet, when Tony proposed the idea, it was hard for anyone to outright refuse. Tony was excited on his own, saying, "It's going to be lively and fun." Just as I was about to intervene and stop Tony, Ryan surprisingly said, "That might be good. There's room here, and Mom will take care of the housework." Sure, the house we bought about 15 years ago is a 4-room and there's enough room. But any daughter-in-law would naturally dislike living with her in-laws. I was appalled by Ryan's lack of consideration for Vanessa's feelings, and was about to scold him when, to my surprise, Vanessa cheerfully agreed. "If you'll handle the housework, that would really help." I was taken aback by this unexpected development. "Aren't you opposed to living with your in-laws?" I asked. Vanessa responded, "Huh? You two seem kind, I don't mind." "But do you mind, Mother?" "If you don't mind, then I welcome it," I answered. While I wasn't against it, I knew it would require effort, and had concerns about potential future conflicts. But opposing it here could make me seem like a meddling mother-in-law, and could lead to immediate disputes, not just future ones. So far, I had no bad impressions of Vanessa, and I thought we could manage well together. Even after a year since we started living together, the relationship between us and the young couple was good. Vanessa worked too, so she and Ryan left the house together in the morning and returned at about the same time. This meant I was alone during the day, which allowed me to manage the housework without feeling burdened. Since no major issues arose in the first year, I believed we could continue living harmoniously. My concerns turned out to be unwarranted. However, 6 months later, Vanessa gave birth to a boy, whom they named Kevin, hoping he would grow up to be kind. Tony and I couldn't get enough of our first grandchild. Tony was so enamored that the house was overflowing with toys. But things started to change about 3 months after Vanessa returned to work from maternity leave. Possibly tired from juggling work and childcare, Ryan and Vanessa began to get irritable and argue. Both of them started taking their frustrations out on Tony and me. Whether it was out of frustration or not, Tony suggested, "Why don't you leave Kevin with Patty and take a 2-day trip?" I was shocked when I heard nothing about it until Tony said, "You're not working, so you have time, right? You could at least lighten the load for your son and his wife." Since Vanessa returned to work, I had been the one looking after Kevin during the day. He was not even a year old yet, and I couldn't take my eyes off him for a second. I had to carry Kevin in a sling while doing the cleaning and cooking, and my back was screaming in pain. Yet, without my consent, Tony took it upon himself to leave it all to me, which upset me. But since Ryan and Vanessa had become irritable, and Kevin had started crying more, I agreed to Tony's proposal, thinking of my grandson. That turned out to be a big mistake. After their trip, Ryan and Vanessa began to dump their son's care on me every week. Vanessa, who had always said she was bad at housework, stopped doing any at all, and didn't even ask for cooking lessons anymore. Even cleaning their own room became "It's getting dirty, so Mom, please clean it up," as Ryan pushed the responsibility onto me, despite having agreed that they would handle their own room. Because they might have things they didn't want seen, Vanessa would say, "I'm too busy with work and taking care of Kevin. Please, Mother." I didn't know where they were going every week, but Ryan and Vanessa began to ask Tony for money before every payday. Even when I'm cooking dinner, they say, "I feel like having pizza today, let's order delivery." Or they come home late without any notice, saying, "We went out to eat." I told Ryan to inform me if they didn't need dinner, but he'd just dismiss it saying, "Dad is a manager, it should be fine," and doesn't listen. I reached my limit and talked to Tony, but he just said, "I've left the household finances up to you," and never reprimanded them. After 3 years of living like this, the year Kevin entered kindergarten, Vanessa gave birth to a girl, Anna. While it was a joyful event, I thought it was too unplanned since I was already unable to take care of Kevin alone. Tony and I decided on having only one child due to financial uncertainties. Ryan was our only child. Yet, Tony would say, "Just because we only have one child, don't take it out on Vanessa." Which was completely off base. I wasn't envious of Vanessa for having a second child. I was still the one taking and picking up Kevin from kindergarten and looking after him on weekends. Given the situation, it seemed impossible for Ryan and Vanessa to take care of a second child. As expected, both shirked their responsibilities onto me under the guise of being busy at work. Even before returning to work, Vanessa left Anna's nighttime feedings to me and slept soundly. Kevin, feeling neglected by his parents or perhaps because I was too busy with Anna, began regressing to baby-like behavior. He started throwing tantrums about not wanting to go to kindergarten and began having night terrors, reaching my physical limits. I pleaded with Ryan and Vanessa, "Please, at least take care of the kids on your days off." I thought it might help me regain some energy for weekdays. However, Ryan retorted, "Mom can only do household chores, so helping with the kids should be fine," and Vanessa said, "I'm working. Unlike you, I'm earning money, so please do at least that much." Tony, hearing I had asked for help, also scolded me. "Our son and his wife are working hard. Can't you at least handle the housework and childcare?" It made me feel as though I was nothing more than a babysitter or maid, which was disheartening. But the grandkids are adorable. As a homemaker, I felt if I didn't do these tasks, the children would suffer. So, I told myself it was my duty as a homemaker and continued to endure. After another 2 years of juggling household chores and childcare, Kevin turned 5 and became a caring big brother to Anna, who could now converse a bit, making childcare somewhat easier. On a rare day when everyone was home for the weekend, I wondered when was the last time this had happened. Kevin, perhaps thinking he'd finally get attention from both parents, didn't leave Ryan and Vanessa's side. While they didn't help with childcare, Tony doted on Anna. I felt deep down that all my efforts were worthwhile. This was how a family should be. As tears welled up in my eyes, I left the care of the grandchildren to the family and went out to shop for dinner. Shopping without the grandchildren was quicker than usual. I decided to spend extra time preparing a slightly elaborate meal while thinking about it. Surrounded by my husband, son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren, I dreamed of a happy future until then. Upon entering the house and heading straight to the kitchen, I could hear Tony, Ryan, and Vanessa talking in the living room. Kevin and Anna must have been napping quietly. Our house has a corridor-style layout with doors leading from the entrance to the kitchen and from the hallway to the living room. It seemed they hadn't noticed my return. I was touched by the scene of family togetherness and felt happy, but then Ryan shockingly remarked, "Is that maid even needed?" Calling her a maid, "Ryan, that's harsh," Vanessa said, laughing. They were probably referring to me. I couldn't believe they would say such things after I had managed both childcare and housework on my own. My happiness instantly turned cold. I hid in a corner of the kitchen, unnoticed, and continued listening. Today too, she dumped the kids on us and went shopping alone. Totally incompetent. Far from scolding them, Tony joined in mocking me. A nagging, incompetent maid is seriously in the way. Should we just live by ourselves? I had always nagged for the family's sake and done the housework. Learning that my son thought this way about me made me realize all my efforts had been in vain. Sounds good. Tony, like Ryan, seemed to want me out of the house. In an instant, my affection for my family cooled completely, and I silently left the house, resolved in my heart. I'll do as I please from now on. Hours later, Tony probably realized the groceries were still in their bags in the kitchen and called me. When I ignored the call, a message arrived. Where are you? Leaving the groceries like that, what are you thinking? He sounded angry, but I was angrier. You're not needed, those were your words after I had struggled alone with the housework and childcare, thinking it was for the family. With that in mind, I continued to ignore their contacts. That day, I stayed at a hotel and, while the family was at work, moved out my necessary belongings. It was sad not to see Kevin and Anna, but it couldn't be helped. Told by both my husband and son that I wasn't needed, I couldn't endure it any longer. Fortunately, I had some savings. In fact, I had been working occasionally, without Tony knowing, before the grandchildren were born. I had been helping out as an assistant at a cooking class run by a friend from my vocational school days. It started when they desperately needed help because another assistant was ill. The vocational school my friend and I attended was for chefs. After working at a major cooking school, my friend opened her own cooking studio at 30. I decided to work there for a while and look for a place to live. Tony called repeatedly every day, but I continued to ignore him. Ryan and Vanessa also kept sending messages. Kevin and Anna are asking where Grandma is. Are you going to make the grandchildren sad? The kids won't listen to us without you. Come back. It hurt to imagine the grandchildren being sad, but they should be more attached to their parents than to me, their grandmother. Their refusal to listen to their parents is the result of Ryan and Vanessa having neglected them. I regret enduring and taking care of everything just because I was a homemaker. I hope they will cherish their time with their parents in the future. A few days after I left the house, Tony sent an email. If you don't come back, let's get divorced. Having already decided to sever ties, I was relieved to be able to divorce without any fuss from Tony and replied, I will come to the house next Sunday to sign the divorce papers. I said I would come instead of return to convey my intention to separate. On the agreed Sunday, when I went to the house, Tony, Ryan, and Vanessa were waiting. Kevin tried to run towards me when he saw me, and Anna toddled towards me but was stopped by Vanessa. This person will no longer be your grandma. Kevin and Anna have Grandma Thompson, right? Thompson is Vanessa's maiden name, but she had only sent presents for birthdays and Christmas with little contact, whether out of consideration for us or some other reason. It didn't matter, as Kevin and Anna barely knew her, almost like a stranger. Kevin isn't the type to open his heart to someone he just knows by name. And Anna might as well not know her at all. It's unreasonable to expect a young child to accept such a person as their grandma. As expected, Kevin and Anna began crying loudly. Then Ryan shouted, "Quiet! Don't cry," not realizing that children of their age cannot be silenced by yelling. The children trembled for a moment and then cried even louder. As Vanessa tried to soothe them on the side, Tony thrust the divorce papers in front of me. It was inappropriate to do this in front of young children. But I was relieved when Vanessa took the kids to the bedroom. At the living room table, I signed the already signed divorce papers by Tony. The witness section also had Ryan and Vanessa's signatures, indicating their agreement for me to leave this house. In fact, as I signed, Ryan, together with Tony, insulted me, getting cocky for an incompetent maid, preaching about wasteful spending without earning a penny. That's why you're in this situation. After signing, I said, it's thanks to this incompetent maid that this house was running, you know? And threw 5 notebooks on the table. What's this? Tony opened the notebooks, and Ryan peered in. But they couldn't understand the meaning written in these notebooks. What, showing us a diary like it's some kind of proof of your hard work? Ryan mocked me. And Tony looked at me in dismay. You're not going to say you don't want a divorce now, are you? I was the one appalled. Tony and Ryan saw these notebooks as just diaries. Indeed, they contain records of the first things Kevin and Anna managed to do, and notes I made to the family that day. But they completely missed that it wasn't just about that. If you can look at that and still feel nothing, I can't imagine you'd be happy without me. As I glared with contempt, Tony Stone shouted at me loudly. Don't get cocky just because you're a maid. If I'm just a maid, perhaps I should be paid? Tony flinched for a moment at my retort, but quickly started to berate me again. Get a grip. Who do you think has been supporting our life all this time? I was dumbfounded by Tony's cliched tyrannical husband responses. So, who do you think has been providing meals without lifting a finger? Who do you think wore the clothes that were washed? Who do you think lived in a cleaned house? I threw back the standard questions. Then Ryan said, house chores? Vanessa can do them too. I've seen Mom do them and laughed, thinking how easy it is. I was appalled that Ryan, even though he has a job, didn't consider doing any housework himself, and I felt regret about how I raised him. I doubted Vanessa could handle house chores as she claimed it was not her forte. But Ryan seemed serious about it. At that moment, Vanessa came from the bedroom and complained, Kevin and Anna have just fallen asleep for their nap, so keep it down. She also had a tantrum, implying that my presence made the family atmosphere sour. It seemed Vanessa was also dissatisfied with me being around, even though I had been taking care of her children in her place. After all, she had left all the childcare to me until the kids were old enough. I realized that to my husband Tony and son Ryan, I was ultimately an outsider, which evoked different feelings when they complained about me. The degree of abuse was worse from Tony and Ryan. However, my feelings towards Vanessa were utterly indifferent. I was beyond anger or dismay. I had not been drying my daughter-in-law's underwear with joy. I was considerate enough to dry them where Tony wouldn't see and fold them. If the daughter-in-law was so brazen, perhaps I shouldn't have bothered to prevent her father-in-law from seeing her underwear. The good impression I had when I first met her had completely vanished by now. Vanessa, without any argument from me, said, "Will you leave after you sign everything? This is no longer your house." But my business wasn't finished yet. If you're done saying what you want, I have something I want to convey too. In front of the puzzled three, I played the voice recorder. Ever since Anna was born, their abuse towards me had only worsened. A friend who runs a cooking class had given me an unused voice recorder. Divorce or not, evidence is crucial, my friend had said. At that time, I had no intention of divorcing. But my friend suggested recording our daily conversations, as they might make for a funny story later. The voice recorder she bought for recording her cooking lectures could record up to about 250 hours. Even if recorded 24 hours, it would last more than 10 days. When I pressed the play button, the first voice heard was Kevin's, along with her saying she loves me. The recording played her asking if her parents hated her. Then, Vanessa's voice upon returning home, coldly dismissing Kevin's greeting, followed by the abuse towards me. Take proper care of the grandkids when I'm tired from work. You're really useless. It wasn't just Vanessa's voice. After she returned home, Tony's voice was also recorded. Clean up the room properly. Toys are scattered everywhere. Even after I explained that the toys were Kevin's playthings, Tony scolded me unilaterally. You're a housewife, you should manage that. Ryan's abusive words towards me were also recorded. Can you stop dumping chores and childcare on Vanessa? That's the job of a housewife, you know? Even when I say that physical touch is important for the parent-child bond. Ryan dismisses it saying, you're just a homemaker, right? If you leave the housework and childcare to Vanessa, then what's the point of your existence? Don't you even understand that? This comment further degrades the role of a homemaker. Of course, the line Ryan had said the other day, useless maid, really in the way, should we live just us? Was also recorded. I will claim damages for the mental suffering I endured from the three of you. All three together refused, but I countered. If you don't accept, shall we go through a lawyer and take this to court? That would add to the legal fees, you know? My firm stance made the three of them waver. The evidence is sufficient, and I have confirmation from a lawyer. What will you do? I pressed further, and perhaps thinking they couldn't win, they agreed to pay the compensation. That was also recorded to avoid any disputes over what was said later. Eventually, I formally hired a lawyer and managed to arrange for the compensation to be paid in installments from each of their accounts. The divorce was finalized, and I found a new place to live, enjoying living alone. Working part-time at a cafe restaurant and at my friend's cooking school. I also started a daily menu blog. I had thought that if my cooking made my family happy, that was enough for me. But having gone to vocational school to make others happy with my cooking was just an excuse I made for giving up on my dreams. A realization I came to after the divorce. I attended vocational school because I wanted to cook delicious meals that many people would appreciate. It was only after the divorce that I realized how much I had suppressed that desire. 6 months into this fulfilling new daily routine, Tony called. Worried about Kevin and Anna, I answered the phone to tell him to go through my lawyer if he had anything to discuss. But before I could even speak, Tony started unloading details that would be embarrassing if spoken to someone else. I eventually got tired of listening and put the phone on speaker while I cooked. Apparently, the household finances had gone up in flames after our divorce. What the hell is going on? They're blowing through all the money I earned. Tony was whining, but I had warned him. He had left all the financial management to me and had refused to listen. But now, Tony was making unreasonable demands. Can't you return even a little of the compensation you paid? It's your son's fault, you know? I had intended to stay silent, but I couldn't hold back and retorted. Was Ryan born to me alone? Aren't you also his parent? I said this knowing he wouldn't listen, as he had ignored me and looked down on me along with Ryan. Then Tony revealed something outrageous. He had not only been making installment payments for the compensation, but also failed to stop Ryan and Vanessa's spending, resulting in him accruing debt. Fearing that his debt would be discovered by the company, he embezzled company funds using his position as a manager. I only intended to borrow it for a short period. I was planning to repay it. Despite his excuses, it's baffling that he couldn't understand that unauthorized borrowing is not debt but embezzlement. Ultimately, not only was the debt discovered by the company, but the embezzlement was too. The president, recognizing Tony's long service, didn't report him to the police but forced him to resign in a form of acknowledgement. It was effectively a dismissal. However, rumors spread from unknown sources, and he struggled to find another job. Approaching 60 and with his background as a former manager, he might be considered difficult to employ. Yet, Tony, with his high pride, was not looking for part-time or temporary work, but a full-time position. There might be such jobs, but they are undoubtedly few and far between. I thought he should prioritize earning whatever he could now. But I didn't point it out since a capable former manager like him should naturally have a better plan. After all, whatever I said, he wouldn't listen. Vanessa doesn't do any housework at all, and the house is a complete mess. I knew she had always said she was bad at housework, and it turned out she never did any. The costs just kept piling up as she outsourced the housework. Overwhelmed, Tony tried to admonish her, but he ended up being blamed by both Ryan and Vanessa. Eventually, the situation impacted Kevin and Anna's upbringing to the point where Ryan decided to take Vanessa and the kids and leave the house. Tony settled on managing his part alone, while Ryan and Vanessa would take care of their children together as a couple. Managing a 4-bedroom house alone proved too much for Tony, and he asked me to remarry him. However, I naturally refused. I didn't want to disrupt my carefree single life, nor did I intend to return to those old days. Tony said, "I was wrong before. Only after being apart did I realize how valuable you were. Living together would make us both happier." But I couldn't see any benefits for myself. Perhaps I might have considered reconciliation before filing for divorce. But now I had no such feelings. I had given him a chance before the divorce was finalized. It was Tony who carelessly missed that opportunity. And now, saying that he needed me didn't sway my heart. Did you properly read the note I left on the day I went to sign the divorce papers? When I asked him that, Tony had even forgotten that he had left a note. The note I had left wasn't just a diary, it was a diary-style budget book. It was a budget book combined with daily records, designed to clearly show expenses if looked at properly. I had made a homemade diary-style budget book in a cheap notebook to keep expenses down. It was Tony's own fault for not looking at it properly and ignoring Ryan and Vanessa's wasteful spending. It's too late now to realize that it was only because I was working secretly that we managed to get by. Please help. I can't do housework, and I don't know how to save money. Tony was just scraping by with day jobs and came asking for help, not knowing what to do. However, I had no desire to start over with Tony. While I was concerned about Kevin and Anna, I couldn't look after my grandchildren forever. It's only proper that Ryan and Vanessa, as parents, take responsibility for raising them. I would be willing to help if something happened to Ryan and Vanessa, but now, while I'm still able to work, isn't the time. Besides, Tony is a stranger since the divorce and a grown adult himself. He should be able to find solutions from his own experiences. If it's something unknown, then relying on Ryan, his blood relative, would be best. After all, it was Tony himself who said he didn't need me. If you want to hire me as a maid, it'll cost you a good amount of money, I said sarcastically and hung up the phone. Since then, I haven't been in contact with Tony, but I am continuing to claim compensation through my lawyer. Once, Ryan also contacted me asking for help, but I firmly refused. If I'm such a useless maid who can't earn a penny, then you and your wife, who both earn incomes, must be capable, right? You don't need my help. After saying that and seeing he had nothing more to say, I hung up the phone and haven't been contacted since. I've heard through the grapevine that their spending continues and their debt is growing. Still, I hear they are working as hard as they can, ensuring their children do not live in want. Meanwhile, I continue to work part-time and help out at a friend's cooking class. Luckily, my friend offered me a full-time position after an employee resigned. And now I can work as an instructor. I am feeling the joy of being able to spend the money I earn on myself. Now that I'm living alone, I think being a housewife is a respectable occupation. If you're alone, you can do housework whenever you like. And even leave things a bit messy if you want. However, a housewife always moves according to her family's needs. Yet why do they often feel marginalized? It's because of the way families treat them. If only they were always appreciated, or at least not looked down upon, they wouldn't feel so marginalized. A family that is healthy and happy, and occasionally shows appreciation, is like receiving a reward. I felt that this reward was insufficient, which is why I could no longer continue feeling marginalized. Everyone's feelings are different, but I believe people need to feel needed to survive. My savings, which I have accumulated through hard work since my single days, were meant to be untouched for our children's future. I never expected those savings to be used for such a thing. Just because we're married doesn't mean anything goes. My name is Alyssa, and I'm 32 years old. I married Greg when I was 24. And I got pregnant soon after. We now have 2 children. My son is 7 and my daughter is 5. Both are growing up healthy without any major illnesses. When my daughter turned 3, I returned to my previous job. 2 years have passed since I resumed work, and now I earn about the same salary as Greg. Since he only contributes the bare minimum to our living expenses, I have to save for myself and our children from my own salary. I really wish Greg would cooperate more. However, whenever I bring up money, he always looks annoyed and even gets grumpy with the children. So, I've stopped talking about money in front of him. Then one day, my sister-in-law Megan came to our house. I happened to be working from home that day. "Alyssa, please. Let me stay with you for a while." As soon as I opened the door, Megan burst into tears and clung to me. Confused by the suddenness, I was perplexed. "Wait, what's going on? My husband wants a divorce." "What? A divorce?" Megan was still single when Greg and I got married. And she only got married a year ago to a man who seemed very kind and worked for a corporation. They looked so happy at their wedding. But now, just a year later, they are talking about divorce. I couldn't just leave her crying, so I let her into the house. I decided to hear her out first. "Well, Megan, I know it's tough, but why suddenly a divorce?" Sniffling, Megan opened up. "I haven't done anything wrong. But he suddenly says he can't stand living with me anymore." "Isn't that terrible?" "What? Your husband said that? Don't you think it's awful?" "You must think I'm pitiable, right, Alyssa?" She pressed me intensely, making me feel undue pressure. However, it's hard to believe that her kind husband would propose divorce without any reason. I managed to calm her down and decided to wait for Greg to come home from work. When Greg returned, we put the kids to bed and started discussing with Megan. "So, Megan, why has it come to divorce? As Greg asked, Megan began crying again. I want to know that too. I've been working hard for him all this time. And yet, he says, it's impossible to live with you. Isn't that cruel? Despite her saying that, there's no way her husband would come up with such an idea without a reason. Listening to her alone won't solve anything. Megan has always had a selfish and willful side. That might be why this divorce is happening. Well, Megan, are you sure there's really no reason at all? Your husband isn't the type to be unreasonable. As I gently defended her husband, Megan glared at me sharply. What, Alyssa? Are you taking his side over mine? I've been working hard as a wife. And yet he's pushing me towards divorce. No. It's not about taking sides. But I doubt he would bring up divorce without any reason. What do you know about him, Alyssa? You're defending him too much. After a pause, Megan looked at me suspiciously. Oh, don't tell me, Alyssa, you're not having an affair with him, are you? What? No way. Oh my, the conversation has taken a strange turn. Of course. There's nothing untoward between Megan's husband and me. I don't even have his contact information. Thankfully, Greg also chimed in. Megan, that's not possible. Don't worry. And I felt a bit relieved. Still, it's curious. Despite Megan claiming she worked hard as a wife, she is vague about why she is facing divorce. I asked Greg to urgently invite his brother over. Megan had already left, saying she didn't want to meet him. Upon arrival, Megan's husband apologized right away, saying, Sorry for causing trouble for you too. I decided to delve into the details because it seemed unlikely such a reasonable person would ask for a divorce without cause. Well, I'm sorry to ask so suddenly, but why did you bring up divorce with Megan? Megan's husband looked troubled and looked down. Did you perhaps cheat on her? Hey, Greg. How can you say such a thing? I scolded Greg for his inappropriate comment. After a moment, Megan's husband finally spoke up. Actually, Megan has spent all of my savings, about $50,000. $50,000. I exclaimed, shocked by the amount. He hadn't been upfront because it involved money, which isn't a pretty topic. $50,000. What did she spend it on? I asked cautiously, and he sighed deeply. I asked her, but she only said it was for living expenses. I've been giving her a fixed amount every month for living expenses. But she said it wasn't enough. Feeling apologetic, I thought to myself, it's believable Megan would do this. Because she had also nonchalantly asked us for money during her single days. She'd say, we're family, right, and even went through my wallet without asking. Knowing this side of Megan, I found her husband's story all too plausible. He slumped in disappointment. If she can explain what she spent my savings on and agrees to repay it, I'd consider pausing the divorce. But she keeps insisting it was for living expenses. I felt terribly sorry for Megan's husband. They don't even have children. And he was giving Megan an allowance. It's suspicious that she spent $50,000 in just a year. Eventually, Greg spoke up. So, if she returns the money, the divorce could be avoided? Yeah. Got it, I'll talk to her about it. Greg took on the responsibility, but I wondered how Megan, a homemaker, planned to repay the money. I wondered if he was going to repay in place of her. After sending Megan's husband off, Megan returned home. What happened? What did he say? As Megan bombarded him with questions, Greg confidently replied, "If you return the $50,000 you spent, he won't ask for a divorce." To which Megan firmly responded, "How could I possibly have that kind of money? I only used it for living expenses and did nothing wrong." It's unclear if Megan really spent it all on living expenses. But her insistence that she's completely blameless is troubling. Megan's husband's decision to propose divorce seems reasonable. Just then, Greg said something outrageous. "Don't worry, Megan, Alyssa has lots of savings." "What?" I exclaimed involuntarily as my money was taken for granted. Megan's eyes lit up as she turned to me. "Really? Alyssa, you should have said something sooner." "No way, this is wrong." "What are they even saying?" "Especially Greg, damn husband. He can't just decide to use someone else's savings." After cursively reprimanding them in my mind, I calmed down and firmly declined. "Well, I can't lend you my savings." "If you really need money, ask Greg." Upon hearing this, Greg inexplicably lashed out. "Hey Alyssa. Megan is really struggling. Don't you want to help her?" "Exactly, Alyssa. With your savings, I could avoid divorcing my husband." Both Greg and Megan were now spouting nonsense, proving they were indeed siblings. I genuinely sympathized with Megan's husband and thought it might be better for him to get a divorce sooner rather than later. Greg, not liking my stance, exploded again. "Are you serious, Alyssa? When my sister, our family, is struggling, you can't even lend just $50,000. Just $50,000. When he said that, something inside me snapped. I felt my body heat up as anger surged through me. Just $50,000. Don't be ridiculous. This money, I saved up from my single days. Why should I use it for your sister who squandered her husband's money? I've always said it's for our children's future." I managed to hold back my trembling body. Megan stood there with her mouth agape, overwhelmed. Greg looked shocked but quickly retorted, "Well, you can just save up again. Megan needs that money now." "Are you kidding me?" "I don't care." I spat back fiercely. "Then you lend her the money if it's so important. You're her real sibling. And isn't it embarrassing to ask your wife to solve your sister's problems?" "What?" Greg turned red with anger, biting his lip, unable to respond. "Fine. I want a divorce from such a heartless woman." "Divorce? You mean you and me?" "That's right. I don't need a heartless woman who won't help family." Suddenly, he rummaged through a drawer and pulled out divorce papers. He signed them and stamped them right in front of me. "Here, sign this quickly." So he kept such documents just in case. I was worried about our children. Taking them away from their father was concerning. He smirked at me, perhaps thinking I wouldn't go through with it. "You can't do it, can you? You wouldn't dare become a single mother suddenly, would you? Better to lend my sister the $50,000, right?" At that moment, everything became irrelevant. I was done. Better to be a single mother than to deal with such ridiculous siblings. I signed the divorce papers and stamped them. "Huh, what?" "Alyssa." He seemed truly shocked that I had signed. "Tomorrow, I'll file these." I started packing my things and the kids silently. Greg, panicking, asked, "Alyssa, you're really going to file that?" "Of course. Why wouldn't I? Why so casually?" "Huh? Didn't you give it to me to sign first? Well, yes, but. The next morning, I submitted the divorce papers to the court first thing. Greg and Megan probably hadn't slept much, as they looked completely worn out. I told the children, let's go to Grandpa and Grandma's house, and prepared them for the move. It seemed cruel to suddenly tell them about the divorce, especially since they are still so young. I planned to explain things to them calmly and simply once we had settled down a bit. When I was leaving with the children, Greg had tears in his eyes. Alyssa, you're coming back, right? This isn't really going to end in divorce, is it? But it is. It's too late to cancel it now. From now on, please indulge your beloved sister to your heart's content and support each other. I said this with heavy sarcasm, throwing the words back at him. However, I truly felt sorry for the children. Due to our selfish reasons, they were losing their father and the home they had lived in. Nevertheless, if I had continued to let those two dictate my life, my savings would have been devoured, and even the future of these children would have been at risk. I refused to have my life thrown into disarray by such unreasonable siblings. I moved back to my parents' house, where I explained the situation and asked to stay for a while. After explaining things in simple terms, the children accepted the situation, saying, as long as Mom is with us, that's fine. And Mom has always been there for us. Greg kept contacting me persistently after that, but now I block all his calls. The divorce has already been finalized, and I plan to hire a lawyer to ensure child support payments. Meanwhile, Megan and her husband also divorced soon after. She claimed to have used the savings for living expenses, but it turned out she had been splurging on luxury brands. When Megan's husband secretly searched her room, he was shocked to find a large stash of luxury goods. As a result, she was forced into divorce and had to reimburse the $50,000 she had spent, without mercy. She managed to return about $20,000 with what was left of Greg's modest savings. But she will have to work to pay back the remaining $30,000. Now that the divorce is settled, I have to pay the property division. Please help me. She tried to appeal to her parents with her usual crying antics. But since I had already explained everything to them, they quickly refused her. Not only Megan, but Greg too was severely reprimanded. And they both ended up being disowned. Really, those siblings are beyond saving. At least I hope they manage without causing trouble for others. I'm truly glad that Greg and Megan didn't end up taking it from me. I will continue to use this money carefully to ensure my children grow up well. I demolished your family home, you know? I was stunned and couldn't even speak at my husband's sudden declaration. My father had recently passed away, and I had inherited our family home and land. My husband had often expressed his desire to demolish my childhood home and build a two-family house, and it seemed he had finally resorted to extreme measures. I was devastated as my childhood home, filled with family memories, was destroyed, and I protested against him in tears, but he just grinned mockingly. Well, tearing it down myself was tough, but I'm glad I was able to clear the land. My name is Kate. I'm currently 27 years old and live with my husband, Matt, who is 3 years older than me. We don't have children yet. Before getting married, I lived with my father and focused on my job. My mother passed away when I was in high school, and since then, my father and I had supported each other. I had planned to work right after graduating high school, and I followed through by getting a job at a local company. I am still with the same company even after getting married. The work environment has been good since I joined, and I find my daily tasks rewarding. Matt has a somewhat unreliable side, but he has always been kind to me, helping with housework when he has time. So I have no complaints about our married life. However, my only concern is that I don't get along well with Matt's parents. At the beginning of our marriage, I wanted to get along with them as my in-laws. But it seemed they didn't think highly of me. They always treated me coldly, which only widened the distance between us. Gradually, I grew tired of interacting with them, and now try to deal with them without causing any waves. Thankfully, we don't live together, and I don't see them often. If we lived under the same roof, I might have collapsed from stress by now. Fortunately, my father lived in the same city, which was a source of strength for me, while the relationship with my in-laws was my only troubling issue. I thought we could continue our married life peacefully without any major conflicts. However, just recently, my father collapsed from an acute myocardial infarction and passed away. I was deeply shocked by the sudden loss of my beloved father. And after the funeral, I visited our family home multiple times to cry alone. But considering my job and life with Matt, I couldn't stay down forever, and I had just started to recover. With my father's passing, I inherited the family home and land, which no longer had anyone living in it. My mother was already gone, and since I have no siblings, the inheritance naturally fell to me as his daughter. Since I completed the inheritance procedures for the land, I've had more opportunities to discuss with Matt what to do about my family home. My father had once said to me, "You know, Kate, once I'm gone, you can do whatever you want with this house and land." In other words, the decision about the empty house was left to me. That house is a precious place where I lived with my family, filled with many memories. So, I have no intention of selling the land or demolishing the house for now. Although I have to pay property taxes, I want to honor my father and mother by sometimes cleaning the house and immersing myself in family memories. For that reason, my plan is to maintain the status quo for a while. However, Matt had a different opinion. When I acquired the assets, he seemed overly excited as if it was his own. It would be a waste to maintain the status quo. Since you've got a great piece of land, we should make effective use of it right away. Matt wanted to utilize the land where my family home stood as soon as possible. And our opinions were split right down the middle. Indeed, the house is located a reasonable distance from the station, and there are large supermarkets and other facilities nearby, making it a desirable location. However, the building itself is old and has many areas in disrepair since it was built before I was born. When we eventually have children, renovating the family home could be one option. Still, I simply could not accept Matt's opinion. This was because Matt was trying to push the discussion forward, as if the house belonged to him, despite it being my family home. Furthermore, my in-laws, who caught wind of the house situation, were similarly involved. They often spoke as if we would all move to that land, making me feel like an outsider in the discussions as the heir. Seeing Matt and my in-laws so delighted, I felt a sense of crisis that my family home would be taken advantage of. So, I repeatedly emphasized to Matt, "Matt, that house and land belong to me, not to you or your parents. So don't go ahead and make plans without me." However, Matt just brushed me off, saying, "I know that. Kate, you worry too much." He never took me seriously. I had thought he was a gentle person despite being somewhat unreliable, but the moment I received my father's inheritance, His demeanor changed, and he hardly listened to me during our discussions. Because of this, I began to distrust Matt for the first time. And that feeling only grew with time. Amidst this situation, we came to a certain holiday. That day, Matt said he was going to his parents' house and left early in the morning. I was busy with household chores that I hadn't managed to finish during the week. However, less than an hour later, Matt returned with his parents. So I had to interrupt my chores to greet them. They might be good parents in Matt's eyes. But given the situation with my family home, I still found it difficult to engage with them. Susan and Steve, what brings you here today? I hadn't heard anything from Matt about his parents' visit. And it was unusual for them to come over together without any prior notice. So I felt a bad premonition. I thought it was time to properly conclude what to do with Kate's family home. So, I brought my father and mother along. Matt answered with a broad smile to my question. My bad feeling had come true, and I felt my mood sink. What do you mean by what to do? I told you several times that I want to leave the house as it is. When I firmly stated this, Matt immediately countered. I've said it's a waste too many times. So, I'm thinking of demolishing your family home and building a new two-family house on that land. Then we can all live under the same roof. Huh? I was taken aback by such an outrageous statement. But I quickly raised my objections. What are you talking about? There's no way I can agree to that. Didn't I tell you not to proceed without my consent? Even as I desperately opposed, Matt and my in-laws just looked at me with exasperated eyes. Eventually, my father-in-law sighed and opened his mouth, sounding annoyed. It's a shame to leave such good land unused. Why don't you start taking Matt's plans seriously? A wife should obey her husband. I couldn't say that Matt had never seriously listened to me. My in-laws care deeply for Matt, so they naturally side with their own son. Moreover, my father-in-law is quite rigid and holds strong beliefs in male superiority, thinking that a wife should naturally obey her husband. If I dared to oppose Matt in front of my father-in-law, he would surely yell. How dare you speak to your husband like that? That's right, Kate. We're already getting older. And we don't know when we might need care. It's better to think about the future and live together in a two-family house. We would feel secure living with you and Matt, my mother-in-law interjected next. While she spoke in a gentle tone, I felt that my mother-in-law just wanted to shift all the bothersome housework onto me by living together. Right now, she was acting like a devoted wife, smiling gracefully next to my father-in-law, but when he was not around, her tone toward me would become much more sarcastic. Whenever I visited my in-laws and found myself alone with her, she would meddle with unnecessary comments about when I would have children, or hurry me to show her my future grandchild. She would also use her age as an excuse to dump all the household chores on me. If I refused, she would insist, isn't it only natural to respect your elders? What kind of family environment did you grow up in that you can't even do something so simple? I couldn't even imagine living in the same house with my in-laws, who constantly treated me with such sarcasm. That house is a precious home filled with memories of my parents and me. I have no intention of demolishing it. Please, just leave it alone for now. I was firm in my stance. However, it seemed that Matt and my in-laws were not willing to give up. Honestly, what a stubborn daughter-in-law you are. Given the future, it's clearly better to build a two-family house and live together. Your parents are gone now, so you should devote yourself to us. I couldn't help but scowl at my mother-in-law's dismissive remark about my parents. but I managed to hold it together. In the end, that day ended without any real discussion. Just everyone clashing opinions, and my in-laws left with displeased expressions. After that, Matt and I continued to clash over the family home and land. Our current house is small, and we should build a larger one for when we have children, right? Matt refused to back down from his insistence on building a two-family home. I could speculate that he just wanted to live in a spacious house with his beloved parents under the guise of wanting to prepare for children. While I understood the desire to live with one's biological parents in the future, I never nodded in agreement. I was convinced that living with my in-laws would only lead to more conflicts. Therefore, regardless of demolishing the family home, I had resolutely rejected any discussions about constructing a two-family house every time it came up. As a result, Matt would invariably become displeased. As these days went on, our relationship gradually became strained, and time passed without any progress in our discussions. In the meantime, whenever I had the chance, I would visit my family home to clean and pay respects to my parents' portraits. However, I entered a busy period at work and became unable to visit my family home for about a month. Because of this, I decided to bring my parents' portraits to my current home and display them in my room during this hectic period. I hadn't told Matt about this, as our conversations had recently escalated into arguments. So I thought it best to keep it to myself. Little did I know, I would soon be reminded that it was a good thing. I had brought at least the portraits from my family home. This incident occurred shortly after the busy period ended on a holiday. I had thought I would finally have a chance to relax, but that morning, my in-laws unexpectedly showed up at my house. Since I had been busy, I hadn't seen them since we discussed the family home. They arrived without prior notice, and Matt hadn't mentioned that his parents were coming. For some reason, they were both in high spirits, looking at me while laughing with Matt. "Today, we have an important matter to discuss with you, Kate." When my mother-in-law said this with a big smile, I sensed that the conversation would likely be something unpleasant. "What do you want to talk about?" When I asked, Matt stepped in front of me and said, "I already demolished your family home." I was left speechless in shock. I thought it might be a cruel joke, but from the triumphant smiles on Matt and my in-laws' faces, I realized it was true. "What? How could you do something so selfish?" Even as I rushed toward him in panic, Matt just smirked at me with an air of confidence. He had taken it upon himself to demolish my family home and land without my permission. Due to the busy period at work, I hadn't been able to check on my family home for the past month. It seemed that Matt had seized that opportunity. "Well, tearing it down myself was tough, but I'm glad I managed to clear the land," he said, feigning exhaustion. He had hesitated to pay for the demolition costs, and instead borrowed heavy machinery from his father, demolishing the house himself. In fact, my father-in-law owned a small factory and had several pieces of heavy equipment. He had likely lent the machinery to help his son without considering the consequences. "Why would you do something like that without asking?" "I've been opposed to the demolition this whole time, haven't I?" I couldn't tolerate the terrible actions of Matt and the others, pleading with a trembling voice. My family home still contained many of my parents' belongings, and there were mementos like childhood family albums. The only thing that remained safe was my parents' portraits, which I had brought home with me. Everything else had been removed along with the rubble, and it felt like a nightmare. "How could you be so cruel? I will never forgive you." I had reached my limit. Even as I glared at Matt, the three of them maintained their smug expressions. "You've been so indecisive for too long, so I made the first move. We can't keep waiting for you to change your mind." Matt had an arrogant attitude, as if he had done the right thing. He continued, "So, I took the land from your family home." His triumphant tone made me feel my anger shifting to disbelief. I could feel the love I had left for Matt quickly fading away. It seemed neither Matt nor my in-laws understood the gravity of their actions, and I let out a deep sigh. "What are you saying? When did I ever agree to give you that land? I didn't even complete any paperwork, so it still belongs to me." It appeared that Matt didn't fully grasp the meaning of my words, looking puzzled, while my in-laws wore similar confused expressions. Since the registration process for the change of ownership had not been carried out, I had no recollection of transferring my family home or land to Matt. Therefore, the act of demolishing someone else's home without permission was, of course, a crime. You may not realize it since you didn't go through a contractor, but what you did is punishable by law. At that moment, Matt's expression hardened. Had he hired a demolition contractor, he might have known the consequences. I had no intention of going easy on him just because we were married, so I continued. "Moreover, using heavy machinery on someone else's land without permission is a crime, even if it belonged to your father's company. I will be pressing charges." Previously, I had researched the legal implications regarding real estate crimes in case of any issues arising from the land I inherited from my father. I never imagined that Matt would actually resort to such extreme measures. When I mentioned the heavy machinery, my father-in-law, who had maintained a calm demeanor until then, suddenly raised his voice. "Wait a minute. You two are married, so Kate's land is effectively Matt's too. Therefore, demolishing that house shouldn't be a crime. I've said it before, but the owner of that house is me, not Matt. Furthermore, I didn't agree to the demolition, nor was I even informed about it. What he did was a clear criminal act, so I will report this to the police. I can't just stand by while my cherished home is destroyed." When I replied calmly, my father-in-law was left speechless. It seemed he had taken this matter lightly. Although he lent his equipment to demolish the house, he hadn't considered that I, as Matt's wife, would think of reporting him. He likely thought he could make excuses after clearing the land. "You're going to report Matt? You're his wife. There's no way you would actually do something so terrible." In place of my silent father-in-law, my mother-in-law shouted in a panic. "You are the ones who are terrible for demolishing someone else's house without permission. This isn't something that can be excused just because you're husband and wife." After replying, I operated my smartphone and thrust the search results in front of Matt. The screen displayed the legal implications of the crime he had committed. "What you did constitutes property destruction. It's a crime that carries a prison sentence without a fine, so you're definitely going to jail." Jail. My father-in-law raised his voice in panic, and my mother-in-law let out a short scream. "Wait. Don't call the police. Think it over, we're married, right?" Matt clung to my arm with a pale face. However, I shook off his hand firmly, saying, "Stop using our marriage as a shield. You destroyed my family home and all my memories." Then I stated, "I'm going to call the police now," and decided right then to report them. It seemed that Matt finally realized the irreversible mistake he had made. "Am I going to be arrested? Me? No way, that can't be true." He mumbled in a tremble, and eventually, he foamed at the mouth and collapsed right in front of me. Afterward, Matt was arrested, and I moved out of the house we had shared and rented an apartment near where my family home had stood. I intended to get a divorce immediately, but since Matt refused, the discussions through our lawyers became prolonged. As a result, I was starting to consider filing for mediation at the family court. In the meantime, I was gathering information about Matt through lawyers and private investigators. What I discovered was that Matt had been frequenting strip clubs for years and had secret debts. He had apparently had his eye on the substantial inheritance I was to receive from my father, believing that if I came into a large sum of money, he could pay off all his debts. When I learned the truth, I was speechless with disbelief. Matt had told his parents about his debts, and shockingly, they had agreed to be co-signers for him. I could easily picture my in-laws immediately agreeing to help him, out of love for their son. Since Matt's arrest, it seemed his parents had been cleaning up after him regarding his debts. One day, I suddenly received a phone call from my mother-in-law. "Kate, help me." The urgency in her voice was palpable. It turned out she was asking me to lend her money outright. Apparently, they were being pressured to repay Matt's debts, and they were struggling financially. "Kate, you have your father's inheritance, right? Please share some of that money with us," she said shamelessly. I couldn't bring myself to take her seriously and replied curtly, "That's not possible. Please manage it on your own," before hanging up. However, anticipating another call, I decided to block my in-laws' phone number. Since I hadn't given them my new apartment address, they probably wouldn't show up at my home. I no longer wanted to be involved with them or Matt ever again. The phone call from my mother-in-law intensified my desire to cut ties with Matt, and I decided to file for mediation for a divorce. Eventually, the mediation was successful, and we got divorced. Afterward, my in-laws lost everything, including their home and my father-in-law's factory, and were left to repay their debts. They reportedly moved to a small apartment in the countryside and were living modestly. Years later, Matt completed his prison sentence, but found it difficult to get a job due to his criminal record. He seemed to have been arrested again for committing petty crimes like shoplifting. After my divorce from Matt, I was able to live comfortably by renting out the land he had cleared. With the inheritance my father left me, I would not have trouble living alone in the future. And I planned to continue working for a long time. Now that I was free from Matt and my in-laws, I felt I could work with renewed vigor. I hadn't thought about remarriage yet, so for the time being, I intended to enjoy my carefree single life while focusing on my job.